The earth is frozen hard in the southern Ural steppe, a brittle crust of ice and winter-killed grass that resists the blade. Below the skin, in the land near the village of Filipovka, a low mound, a kurgan, sleeps beneath a sky the color of lead. Archaeologists work against the cold, their breath pluming in the still air as they carefully breach the silence of a burial chamber that has held its peace for over 2 millennia. The frost clings to the ancient timbers, a glittering crystalline dust that settles over the darkness within. As light touches the interior, it is not darkness that answers, but a sudden, breathtaking flare of gold. The chamber is a frozen scene, a moment of profound reverence trapped in permafrost. Here lies not one, but a collection of ritual burials, a silent assembly of nobles from a world lost to memory. The most striking are the stags, great, stylized figures of deer, their bodies carved from wood and then completely encased in thick, hammered gold. Their antlers sweep back in impossible, elegant arcs, creations of a master artisan who understood the spirit of the steppe. They seem to have just paused in mid-stride, listening for a sound that faded 25 centuries ago. Beside them, in other chambers, lie figures dressed in finery that has crumbled to dust, leaving only the gleaming metal that adorned it. Thousands of golden plaques, buckles, and ornaments lie scattered like fallen leaves. And here, too, are the warrior women, their bones resting beside iron arrowheads, daggers, and the ghostly remnants of bows. Their presence is not a question, but a statement, veiled in the silence of their long, unbroken rest. These are the golden tombs of Filipovka, an unanswered question written in iron and gold, a whisper of the people who raised these mounds and filled them with such fierce, beautiful belief. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where and when you're listening from tonight. These tombs, these silent repositories of wealth and warrior spirit, are the first true echo of the people who would come to be known as the Sarmatians. Before their name was ever etched into Roman reports or Greek geographies, they were here, a collection of tribes moving through the vast, open spaces of the southern Urals, a people defined not by cities of stone, but by the rhythm of the herd and the horizon. The frost-locked chambers of Filipovka offer an insight not into their daily lives, but into their deepest conceptions of the cosmos, of power, and of the journey that followed the closing of the eyes. The sheer volume of gold is not mere wealth. It is a conduit for power, a sun metal intended to light the darkness of the afterlife. The craftsmanship is staggering, a unique language of art. This is the animal style, a visual lexicon shared by the nomadic cultures of the great Eurasian steppe. But the Filipovka masters took it to an extreme of elegance and abstraction. The stags are not just deer, they are emblems of speed, wilderness, and perhaps the soul's flight. Other golden plaques depict griffins, boars, and eagles, a menagerie of real and mythic beasts that held the world together. The artists who made them understood the curve of a muscle, the tension of a leap, the fierce poise of a predator. They hammered this understanding into metal, creating a portable art that could be carried across the endless grasslands, sewn onto clothing, or in the final act, buried in the cold earth as a testament to a life lived in motion. And then there are the women. In Kurgan 1, the great kurgan of the cemetery, a female burial was found, not as a consort or a secondary figure, but as a center of power. She was laid to rest with the artifacts of a priestess, perhaps, or a ruler. Her garments were stitched with hundreds of gold plaques, her status unmistakable. In adjacent mounds, other women were buried with their weapons, their bronze-tipped arrows and iron swords resting beside their hands. This physical evidence, locked in the frozen ground, gives weight to the ancient stories that would later filter out of the steppe, whispers of warrior women who rode alongside men, who drew the bow and threw the spear, and who were not confined to the hearth of a wooden hut, but lived their lives in the saddle under the immense open sky. These are not Amazons of myth, perhaps, but something more real. Women of a society where survival and skill transcended the boundaries that settled cultures would later draw. The cold that preserved these tombs is the same cold that defined the lives of those who built them. It is a world of harsh, bright light, of winds that travel 1,000 miles without impediment, of winters that freeze the ground solid and summers that bake it dry. To live here required constant adaptation, a relationship with the horse that was more than symbiotic. It was spiritual. The horse was legs, wealth, and weapon. The treasures of Filipovka were paid for by the mastery of this landscape, by controlling the herds and perhaps the trade routes that were beginning to wind their way from east to west. The light fades from the tomb. The golden stags are catalogued. The warrior woman's arrows are numbered, and the earth is gently replaced. But the silence they have broken lingers. These tombs are a prologue, a magnificent, frozen overture to a story that will soon spill out from these eastern plains, a story of movement, of collision, and of a people whose cavalry would one day test the very boundaries of the Roman world. The first notes have been struck, here in the frozen heart of the steppe, a sound as clear and cold as hammered gold. The camera pulls up and away from the frozen mounds, rising high until the human figures fade into the texture of the earth. It lifts higher still, leaving the Filipovka kurgans behind, turning west to drift over the true birthplace of the nomadic soul. This is the Pontic Caspian steppe, the greatest unbroken grassland on the planet, an ocean of earth stretching from the Ural River in the east to the Carpathian Mountains in the distant, hazy west. It is a world defined not by what is present, but by what is absent. No mountains slice the sky, no forests break the wind, no cities cast a shadow. There is only the curvature of the earth, the immense bowl of the sky, and the grass that carpets everything in between. The horizon is a perfect, shimmering line, a promise of infinity that pulls the eye and the spirit forward. This is the endless grass sea. In the long months of summer, it is a whispering, moving entity, a million shades of green, olive, and gold. The wind, its only permanent resident, travels unobstructed for 1,000 miles, bowing the feather grass in long, fluid waves that mimic the surface of deep water. The sound is a constant, sibilant hush, the breath of the continent itself. The air is thick with the scent of dry earth, sun-baked thyme, and the bitter, clean aroma of wormwood. This is a landscape of immense scale and profound subtlety, where the only events are the passing of a cloud's shadow, the sudden flight of a bustard, or the distant, shimmering mirage that makes the horizon tremble. It is a land that demands a different way of seeing, a gaze trained for the far distance to spot the dust of a moving herd or the flicker of movement many miles away. When the seasons turn, the sea of grass transforms. Autumn brings a deep, brittle silence as the green fades to ochre and bronze. The air grows sharp, carrying the first premonition of frost. Then comes the winter, not as a gentle blanket, but as a tyrant. The steppe disappears under a vast, seamless sheet of white, the sky a low, oppressive gray. The wind becomes the burin, a blizzard of fine, dry snow that scours the landscape, erasing all features, piling drifts against the low riverbanks, and burying the kurgans deeper in white anonymity. The cold is absolute, a presence that cracks the frozen earth and stills all life. In this white desert, survival is an art of endurance, a testament to the warmth of the herd and the resilience of life huddled against the ice. But this harshness makes the spring a miracle of shocking, violent beauty. When the snows finally retreat, the meltwater turns the lowlands into temporary shallow seas, reflecting the high, brilliant blue sky. Almost overnight, the steppe explodes in a riot of color. Millions of wild tulips, yellow, white, and a fiery scarlet, burst from the damp earth, followed by purple irises and waves of blue sage. For a few brief, precious weeks, the endless grass sea becomes a garden, a carpet of impossible vibrancy under the warming sun. This is the time of new life, when the herds grow fat, and the air, free of winter's bite, feels like a benediction. This brief, intense flourishing is the engine of life, the pulse that sustains the nomadic world through the long, lean months that will inevitably follow. Through this vast, seasonal canvas, the great rivers cut their ancient paths. The Ra, the river the Greeks would later call the Volga, flows south, a massive artery of water and reeds. Further west, the Tanais, the modern Don, draws the boundary line, a place of crossing, a gateway between the wilder east and the lands that brush against the settled world. These rivers are the only true landmarks, corridors of life lined with willow and poplar, their muddy waters a stark contrast to the dry plains. They are lifelines for the herds, sources of fish and waterfowl, and the natural highways that will guide the great migrations. Yet even they are dwarfed by the sheer expanse of the steppe itself, mere ribbons of blue and green stitched across a continent-sized tapestry. This is the cradle. It is a landscape that shapes the soul, forging a people who mirror its qualities. To live here is to be perpetually in motion, to understand that security lies not in walls, but in mobility. The steppe teaches its children to read the sky for weather, the grass for pasture, and the horizon for both opportunity and danger. It instills a fierce independence, a profound connection to the horse, and a worldview that is as wide and uncool. I stopped here to correct course. The prompt asks me to avoid psychological effect and direct analysis of the people, instead focusing on the place. I must describe the cradle, not the baby. This is the cradle. It is a landscape that demands observation. The steppe eagle hangs motionless on the high thermal currents, its sharp eyes scanning the grass for the flicker of a marmot. Herds of saiga antelope, with their strange humped noses, flow over the rises like liquid, their movements dictated by the scent of rain on the wind. The silence is broken by the chirr of insects, the bark of a fox in the shallow ravines, or the distant mournful cry of a crane. At night, the world dissolves. The land becomes a flat, black disk under a dome of stars so bright and dense they seem to possess a weight, a glittering ceiling that presses down on the silent earth. The Milky Way is not a faint smear, but a river of light, a celestial parallel to the Volga and the Tanais below. This world of grass, wind, and light is the essential element, the first character in the long story that is to unfold. It is the great, indifferent stage upon which the Sarmatians will first learn their lines. Their art will reflect the animals that share this space. Their movements will follow the patterns of the seasons, and their destiny will be to carry the memory of this endless horizon with them when they finally turn their wagons west. The wind that blows over the Filipovka mounds begins here, gaining strength as it sweeps across the empty spaces, carrying the scent of dried herbs and the promise of a future yet unwritten. The endless grass sea waits, holding its breath. From the vast, indifferent silence of the steppe, a human voice finally emerges, carried on the warm winds blowing west across the Black Sea. It is a Greek voice, inquisitive and meticulous, belonging to a man from Halicarnassus named Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era. As he meticulously chronicles the world he knows, his gaze turns north and east, past the familiar shores of the Euxine Sea, beyond the territory of his Scythian informants, to the lands across the Tanais River. It is here, in this realm of grass and distance, that he records the first great whisper concerning the people who lived there, the Sarmatians, and the origin story he was told, a tale that blends myth, memory, and the unmistakable imprint of steppe life. The story, as Herodotus heard it, begins with a ship, Amazons, the warrior women of legend, defeated by the Greeks at the Battle of Thermodon, are being carried away into captivity, but they rise up, overtaking their captors and seizing the vessel. They are warriors, not sailors. Ignorant of navigation, they are carried by wind and current across the sea until they make landfall on the shores of Scythia, near the Sea of Azov. Finding themselves in a strange open land, their first act is to seize the most valuable resource they can find, a herd of horses. Mounting these, they begin to ride and raid the Scythian territory, their appearance and ferocity a shock to the local tribes. The Scythians, mystified by these mounted warriors, at first do battle with them, but when they come to inspect the bodies of the fallen, they discover they have been fighting women. A council is held. They decide not to kill these strange, fierce newcomers, but to woo them. They send a contingent of their youngest, most virile men to set up a camp near the Amazons, instructing them to imitate their nomadic ways and slowly, patiently seek an alliance. The two groups, separated by a low ridge, watch each other. The young Scythians hunt, and the Amazons hunt. A tentative connection is made, a parley across the grass. The Amazons, Herodotus says, do not speak the Scythian tongue, and the Scythians do not understand theirs. They communicate with gestures, two bands of young riders in a vast, empty landscape. Eventually, the alliance is forged, and the Scythian youths propose marriage, a merging of the two peoples. The Amazons accept, but with a condition that echoes the very spirit of the steppe. They tell the men they cannot live in the Scythian way. They cannot, they say, live in wagons with the other Scythian women who remain behind while the men hunt. Their custom is different. They draw the bow, they throw the javelin, they ride horses, and they have not learned the work of women. They propose that they and their new husbands take their portion of the inheritance and move east across the great river Tanis to found a new people. The Scythians agree, and so they cross the river, settling in the lands that would become the heart of the Sarmatian territory. This is the legend that Herodotus presents. But it is the postscript that carries the most weight, the observation he makes about the people descended from this union, the Sarmatians of his own day. He reports that their women have held fast to the ancient Amazonian customs. They ride to the hunt on horseback, sometimes with their husbands and sometimes without. They ride into battle, a detail that must have astonished his Greek audience. And, he notes, no girl may marry until she has first killed an enemy in combat. This ethnographic detail, this Amazonian whisper, is the first attempt by the classical world to understand the unique culture taking shape on the eastern steppe. Whether the story of the shipwrecked Amazons is literal truth or a mythic explanation for a startling social reality is lost to the mists of time. But the whisper itself is powerful. It aligns remarkably with the silent testimony of the Kurgans, with the women of Filipovka laid to rest with their arrows and their daggers. It suggests a society where the lines between roles were blurred by the necessities of nomadic life, where a woman in the saddle, proficient with a bow, was a vital part of the tribe's survival and its military might. The Greeks, hearing this, could only filter it through their own mythology, through the lens of the Amazons, the only precedent they had for such formidable women. But for the Sarmatians themselves, it was simply life. The story Herodotus captured was the echo of a culture where the wind in the grass, the thunder of the hoof, and the pull of the bowstring belonged to all. For centuries, the masters of the western steppe, the lands from the Don River to the Danube, had been the Scythians. They were a people of terrifying renown, a name that resonated with fear and awe in the halls of Athens and the palaces of Persia. They were the horse archers who had humbled the armies of Darius the Great, the lords of vast herds and magnificent opulent tombs. Their royal Scythians, as described by the Greeks, ruled a confederation of tribes from the rich lands of the Dnieper River, growing fabulously wealthy from the trade in grain, which they sold to the Greek city-states dotting the coast of the Black Sea, places like Olbia and Panticapaeum. Their kurgans, massive mounds of earth, concealed chambers overflowing with intricate gold, not the abstract animal art of the deep steppe, but pieces influenced by the finest Hellenic masters, depicting vivid scenes of Scythian life, warriors stringing their bows, comrades tending to wounds, and men taming their powerful horses. They were, for a long time, the undisputed power of the Pontic steppe, but time, which flows like the great rivers, eventually slows and eddies, and power that seems eternal begins to wane. A twilight, slow and imperceptible at first, began to descend upon the Scythian world in the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era. The reasons were complex, a convergence of shadows that gradually eroded the foundations of their dominance. Perhaps their success had become a vulnerability. Their reliance on the grain trade tied them to the coastal cities, anchoring their nomadic spirit to the earth. They became rich, but perhaps they also became less hard, less fluid than the people of the open grass sea. The climate may have shifted, the rains becoming less predictable, the pastures that fed their immense herds beginning to thin, forcing them into conflict over diminishing resources. Their confederation, always a loose alliance, may have begun to fray. Into this long autumnal evening, a new pressure began to build from the east. Across the Tanais, the great river that had long served as their border, the Sarmatian tribes, the Iazigis, the Roxolani, the Saracens, were watching. They were a harder people, fresh from the deeper, wilder steppe, their culture untouched by the softening influence of Greek wine and settled agriculture. They were the children of the Sarmatian Amazonian whisper, and their numbers were growing. They, too, were masters of the horse, but they were developing new ways of war, new concepts of heavy cavalry that the Scythians, with their light archers, would struggle to counter. The Scythian twilight was not just a fading of their own light, but the shadow cast by a new body rising on the eastern horizon. The press westward was not a single cataclysmic invasion. It was not a great war declared by trumpet and herald. It was instead a slow, inexorable, and terrifying infiltration, a process of displacement that spanned generations. It was the movement of a few wagons at first, then a clan, then a whole tribe, testing the boundaries, crossing the Tanais to graze their herds on Scythian lands. It was the sudden, brutal skirmish over a winter camp or a river crossing. It was the steady, relentless pressure of a rising tide against an eroding shore. The Scythians, caught between this eastern pressure and the settled kingdoms to their west, found their world shrinking. Their control of the vast open steppe, the source of their power, was being challenged, not in a pitched battle, but in 1,000 daily contests for space. The golden light on the Scythian kurgans began to look different. It was no longer the brilliant light of midday, but the slanted, melancholy light of late afternoon. The sounds of their camps, once that undisputed chorus of the plains, now had to listen for a new sound from the east, the rumble of different hoofbeats, the creak of wagons belonging to a people who carried the harsh, cold wind of the Urals in their cloaks. The Scythians were pushed back, their tribes fragmenting. Some were absorbed by the arriving Sarmatians, their bloodlines merging with the new masters. Others were forced south into the Crimean Peninsula or west toward the Danube, becoming a shadow of their former selves, a lesser Scythia. The long, golden age of the first steppe lords was ending, not with a clash of empires, but with the slow, persistent turning of the world, as one nomadic wave replaced another, as it had always done, as it always would. The sun was setting on the Scythians, and the steppe was being cleared for a new, and perhaps more formidable, horse lord. The Tanas River, the modern Don, cuts a slow, wide, and muddy path through the steppe, a vast, somnolent artery of water separating Asia from Europe. Its banks are low, often indistinct, blurring into marshes of whispering reeds and willow thickets. The water itself is heavy with the silt of the plains, a brown, opaque current that moves with a deceptive, quiet strength. For generations, this river had been a boundary, a line on the mental map of the steppe, the western edge of the Sarmatian homeland and the eastern frontier of Scythian power. Now, in the final centuries before the Common Era, that line was being erased, not by a change in the river, but by the movement of a people. The Tanais was no longer a barrier, it was becoming a passage. The migration did not arrive as an army, but as a moving nation, a flow of life that stretched back to the horizon. From the eastern bank, the tribes came on. The air, once filled only with the cries of river birds and the sigh of the wind, now carried a new set of sounds. First, a low, continuous rumble, the vibration of innumerable hooves and wooden wheels transmitted through the damp earth. Then, the sound itself, the creak and groan of thousands of wagons, a sound of immense friction, of wood against wood, of ungreased axles turning under the weight of a civilization. This was the sound of the owl in motion, the great nomadic village. Each wagon was a home, its heavy felt and leather dome, the kibika, stretched over a wooden frame, a portable, weatherproof yurt on a heavy, four-wheeled chassis. These were drawn not by swift horses, but by the slow, patient, irresistible power of oxen. Their broad heads bowed as they leaned into the yokes. Inside these rolling homes were the accumulated possessions of a life: rolled carpets, leather bags of fermented mare's milk, bronze cauldrons, iron tools, and the sleeping forms of children and the elderly. Alongside them, driven in vast, chaotic, and fluid rivers of their own, came the herds. Thousands upon thousands of cattle, their horns a moving thicket, load with a deep, resonant sound that filled the air. Flocks of fat-tailed sheep, a walking larder, moved like woolen clouds over the grass, their bleating a high counterpoint to the cattle's base. And everywhere there were the horses. Not the heavy draft animals, but the light, tough, and indispensable ponies of the steppe, ridden by men and women alike, their sharp-eyed riders darting back and forth, keeping the herds from straying, their voices calling to one another in a language the Greeks and Scythians did not understand. When this tide of life reached the Tanais, it did not stop. It merely paused, swelling at the river's edge, a mass of humanity and animal life preparing for the ordeal of the crossing. Scouts on horseback swam their mounts across, testing the current, finding the shallows and the firmest ground. Then the great movement began. The noise was immense, the shouting of the herders, the high-pitched whinnying of frightened horses, the deep, distressed bellowing of the oxen being forced into the water, and the constant sucking sound of mud. The banks, soft and alluvial, were quickly churned into a deep, treacherous mire, a brown porridge of earth and water that clung to everything. The wagons were the greatest challenge. They were pushed and dragged down the slick banks, their great wheels sinking deep. Some were partially disassembled, their felt coverings removed. Others were floated, their wooden bases surprisingly buoyant, pulled by teams of swimming horses, their riders leaning low, guiding them toward the far bank. Cattle were driven in great herds, swimming with their heads just above the brown water, a frantic, splashing mass. The river, for a time, was choked with life, a bridge of moving bodies. It was a slow, exhausting, and dangerous process. Wagons overturned, their contents spilling into the current. Animals were lost, swept away by the quiet, powerful flow. But the movement was relentless. Reaching the western bank was not a victory, but a continuation. The first wagons to emerge were dragged up the muddy incline, the oxen straining, their hooves finding purchase in the new Scythian earth. They did not stop to build a fortress or a city. They paused only to regroup, to let the animals graze on the fresh, untrampled grass, to wait for the rest of the clan to make the passage. The smoke of their damp wood fires, the first Sarmatian campfires in the west, rose into the gray sky, a signal that the world had changed. They had left the eastern plains behind, the endless grass sea of their ancestors. They had crossed the Tanais, and before them lay a new destiny, a new horizon, and the lands of a fading power. The great westward press had truly begun. The great wave that had breached the Tanais did not move as one single entity. It was, in truth, a collection of waves, a series of great tribal confederations, each with its own name and its own destiny, bound by a shared language and a common way of life. As they spread into the former Scythian lands, they began to diverge, seeking out the pastures that would sustain their herds. The Aorsi and Cerasis remained closer to the east, their power settling around the Sea of Azov and the foothills of the Caucasus, their hands already reaching for the rich trade routes flowing from Asia. The Roxolani pushed west, but paused, claiming the rich, black earth steppe north of the Black Sea, a vast plain that gave them space to roam. But one group, the westernmost vanguard of the Sarmatian world, kept moving. These were the Iazyges. Their journey was a slow, generational drift, a relentless westward pressure that carried them across the entire breadth of the Pontic steppe. They left the Dnieper River behind, a silver ribbon on the plains, and then the Dniester, its high rocky banks a momentary obstacle. They were a people drawn by the setting sun, their wagons creaking over the graves of the Scythian kings they had displaced. The landscape around them began to change, the infinite flatness of the steppe giving way to a new topography. To their north, the horizon began to swell, rising into the foothills and then the deep, forested mountains of the Carpathians, a great, sickle-shaped barrier that turned their migration southwestward, guiding them as a riverbank guides a current. They followed this new path, skirting the dense forests where their horses were useless, and descended from the passes into a vast new basin. This was the Pannonian Plain, the great Hungarian Plain. It was a landscape that felt both familiar and foreign. It was a steppe, a vast, flat expanse of grass perfectly suited to their nomadic life, a new ocean for them to occupy. But unlike the Pontic Sea, this one was enclosed. It was a bowl, its rims defined by the Carpathians to the east and north, the Dinaric Alps to the south, and to the west, another more formidable range, the Alps themselves. The plain was richer, perhaps, wetter, cut by the wandering, lazy curves of the Tisa River. Here, the Iazyges spread out, their owls establishing new territories, their herds growing fat on the lush grasses. For a time, they were the new masters of this enclosed plain, bordered by the Celtic tribes of the mountains and the Dacians in the eastern hills. But the migratory impulse, the deeply ingrained need to know the horizon, continued to pull their vanguard west. Scouts and herders, pushing the limits of their new pastures, rode on until they were stopped, not by a mountain, but by a river. This was not the muddy, familiar Tanis. This was the Danuvius, the Danube. It was a deep, powerful, and relentless river, flowing with a swift, green-gray current, a true continental divide. Its banks were lined with dense, ancient forests of oak and beech, a dark wall that the steppe folk regarded with suspicion. And across that river, on the western bank, they saw something utterly alien. It was not more grass, not another tribe's wagons. It was the limes, the frontier of the Roman Empire. They saw cleared fire breaks in the forest, wooden watchtowers rising at regular intervals, their signal fires sending plumes of smoke into the sky. They saw the straight, unnatural lines of Roman roads, the ditches and palisades of auxiliary forts, and perhaps, in the distance, the glint of light on a legionary helmet, the unmistakable shimmer of an eagle standard. This was not a fluid boundary like the Tanais, but a hard, defended, and conceptual line. It was the place where the Imperium had declared that the ordered world ended and Barbaricum began. The Ayaziges horsemen, their faces weathered by the long journey from the east, their polychrome inlaid armor a stark contrast to the utilitarian iron of the Romans, sat their mounts at the river's edge. Their horses, coated in the dust of the Pannonian plain, lowered their heads to the bank and drank deeply from the water that belonged to Rome. It was a quiet moment, the lapping of the water against the shore the only sound. The nomadic world, in its constant fluid expansion, had just touched the greatest settled empire the world had ever known. The two forces, one defined by motion and the other by stone and law, now faced each other across a current of water, and the long, violent history of the Danubian frontier was about to begin. While the Ayaziges had settled into the Pannonian basin, their cousins, the Roxolani, had claimed the vast open plains that stretched from the Carpathian foothills to the Dnieper River. This was a land of rich, black earth and endless pasture, a perfect cradle for a people whose wealth was counted in the thunder of hooves. They lived closer to the heart of the old Scythian power, and they grew strong there, watching the growing, luminous wealth of the Roman Empire, which lay just across the broad, lower Danube. The province of Moesia, with its settled villas and garrisoned towns, presented a tempting target, a concentration of wealth that the steppe had never known. In the winter of 69 CE, a time when the empire was distracted, torn apart by the civil war of the four emperors, the Roxolani saw their opportunity. The Danube was frozen. The great river, usually a formidable flowing barrier, had become a solid, gray-white highway of ice, a bridge of nature's own making that spanned the limes and invited the crossing. The Roxolani did not come as migrants, with wagons and families. They came as a storm. 9,000 horsemen, a number that Roman chroniclers would record with a note of dread, moved across the frozen water. The sound of their crossing was a deep, percussive groaning, the sound of thousands of hooves on thick ice, a sound like a cracking world. They fell upon Moesia with the sudden, shocking violence of a blizzard. But this was not the warfare the Romans knew. This was not the skirmishing of light horse archers. This was the first, terrifying taste of the cataphract. The legionaries, perhaps from the Legio III Gallica or the 8 Augusta, were trained for disciplined infantry warfare, for the pilum and the gladius, the shield wall and the short, stabbing thrust. What they saw emerge from the winter mist was a vision from a nightmare forge. These were not men on horses. They were men fused with horses, transformed into metallic centaurs. The Roxolani rider was encased in iron. His helmet, conical and alien, left only his eyes visible. His body was protected by a heavy coat of scale armor, or perhaps lamellar, plates of iron stitched to a leather backing, covering him from his shoulders to his knees. Even his horse, a large, powerful steppe breed, was armored, its head covered by a metal chamfron, its chest and flanks protected by a tamen of overlapping scales. And they carried not the bow or the javelin, they carried the contos. This was a lance of shocking proportions, a spear 12 to 15 feet long, thick as a man's wrist, and tipped with a heavy, leaf-shaped iron head. It was not a weapon to be thrown. It was a weapon to be held, gripped with both hands, couched under the arm, a massive kinetic spike that was an extension of the horse's full momentum. The Roxolani, thundering in a dense wedge-shaped formation, were not a cavalry screen. They were a living battering ram. As they charged, the sound was not just the drumming of hooves, but the high, eerie shriek of their Draco standards, great dragon-shaped windsocks of cloth and metal that writhed and hissed in the wind. The first charge of the Roxolani cataphracts was a revelation of terror. They hit the Roman auxiliary lines with an impact that shattered shields, broke spears, and punched clean through the Larica Hamada chainmail of the legionaries. The Contos had a reach that outreached the Roman gladius entirely, killing the infantrymen before they could even bring their own weapons to bear. The armored horses, impervious to a desperate sword thrust, crashed into the ranks, trampling men underfoot. The Roxolani charge was a single, devastating impact of iron and horseflesh, a new arithmetic of war that the Romans were utterly unprepared for. The legions for the first time had met the armored, lance-bearing heavy cavalry that would one day evolve into the knight of the medieval world. The historian Tacitus, recording the event, noted the Roxolani's terrifying power, but also their critical weakness. On the charge, on open, solid ground, they were invincible. But in the mud and thaw that followed a sudden change in weather, their armor became a deadly burden. The heavy, iron-clad riders, if unhorsed, could barely move, let alone remount. The Roman legionaries, recovering from the initial shock, learned to target the horses, to fight in the mud, to use their discipline to surround and isolate these iron men. The raid was eventually defeated, the Roxolani driven back across the Danube by a Roman force that had adapted. But the lesson had been learned. A new and dreadful power had announced itself on the frontier. The sound of the cataphract charge, the sheer crushing weight of it, would echo in Roman nightmares for centuries to come. While the Iazyges tested the iron wall of the Roman limes on the Danube, and the Roxolani shocked the legions with their armored thunder, a different destiny was unfolding for the Sarmatian tribes who had remained in the east. The camera drifts back from the bloody banks of Moesia, across the plains of the Roxolani, and over the Tanais. It settles on the vast, crucial isthmus of land that lies between the Sea of Azov, with its warm, marshy shores, and the immense inland sea of the Caspian. This is the gateway to the Caucasus Mountains, a green, fertile plain that funnels all movement from the deep heart of Asia toward the west. Here, in this strategic corridor, lived the Saracens and the fabulously powerful Aorsi. These tribes had watched their cousins depart, had felt the pull west, and had, for the most part, refused it. They understood a different kind of power. They were not at the edge of the world. They were at its center. This land, the Ciscaucasian steppe, was the northern terminus, the great artery of the trade routes that were beginning to bleed wealth, ideas, and exotic goods from the distant, half-mythical empires of the East. This was the northern spoke of the Silk Road. The Saracens, settled closer to the Sea of Azov, had become partly agricultural, their oils more permanent, their warriors serving as a buffer and a bridge to the Greek Sarmatian kings of the Bosporan kingdom. But the Aorsi and the Upper Aorsi, as the geographer Strabo called them, were the true lords of the route. Their territory stretched east, a vast, undefined kingdom of grass that touched the Caspian Sea and perhaps extended far beyond into the deserts of Central Asia. The Aorsi controlled the crossroads. Their camps, vast cities of wagons and felt yurts, were pitched along the Volga Delta and the passes of the Caucasus. They were not mere raiders or barbarians. They were the masters of transit, the guarantors of passage. A great caravan, having survived the deserts of the Taklamakan and the high passes of the Pamirs, would emerge onto the Aorsi steppe, and it would be the Aorsi cavalry, not bandits, that would ride out to meet them. They were the customs agents, the protectors, and the middlemen of the ancient world. Imagine the sight: a long, slow-moving train of two humped Bactrian camels, their bells a high, rhythmic jingle against the constant steppe wind. They are loaded with bales of tightly woven silk from Han China, a fabric so fine it feels like water in the hand. Beside them, merchants with weathered foreign faces, Sogdians, Persians, perhaps even Indians, guard their smaller chests, which are filled with lapis lazuli from Badakhshan, carnelian and turquoise from Persia, and spices that carry the scent of lands no Roman had ever seen. This river of wealth flows directly into the AOL of the Aorsi, a sprawling camp that has become a global emporium. The air, usually smelling of horse, leather, and sheep's wool, is now tinged with the alien perfume of sandalwood and incense. Here, in the wagon-bound market, the trade is made. The Sarmatians offer their own goods: fine, tough horses, the thick, warm felt of their yurts, all cattle, and most valuable of all, the luxurious, dark northern furs, marten, fox, and ermine, that were prized in the decadent cities of the South. But mostly, they offer passage and protection, and for this, they take their payment in the goods of the world. The gold that once adorned their warriors, as seen in the Filipovka tombs, is now supplemented by a cascade of new materials. Their smiths and artisans, masters of the animal style, begin to inlay their golden stags and griffins not just with local stones, but with the brilliant blue of lapis and the deep red of carnelian, creating the vibrant polychrome style that would become their hallmark. This trade was the source of their staggering power. Strabo, writing with a tone of disbelief, reported that the Aorsi, who controlled the trade from India and Babylonia, were so wealthy they wore gold in their clothes, and that their upper faction could field an army of 200,000 horsemen. The number may be an exaggeration, but the truth it implies is not. This wealth, this silk and gold, was the currency they used to buy loyalty, to forge alliances, and to equip their own cataphracts. The iron scales, the long Kantos lances, the heavy armor for both horse and rider, these were expensive. The Aorsi and Saraces, funded by the commerce of a continent, could afford to field them in numbers that dwarfed their western cousins. They were the merchant princes of the steppe, a kingdom of grass and silk, their power as vast and as remote as the eastern horizon from which the caravans came. The camera glides low over the grass, approaching the source of the great, low rumble. It is not the sound of war, but the sound of life in motion. This is the AUL, the wagon-bound world of the Sarmatians, a moving city, a self-contained universe of felt, wood, and flesh. The first and most pervasive sound is the creaking, a constant deep-throated groaning of wood against wood, the ungreased axles of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of heavy wagons turning with the slow, patient pace of the oxen that pull them. It is a sound so constant It becomes a kind of silence, the auditory backdrop to all of life. This is the rhythm of the nomadic heart, a slow, unstoppable crawl across the landscape, a few miles a day, every day, from one pasture to the next. These are not mere carts, they are homes. The kibitka is a masterpiece of portable architecture. A heavy four-wheeled chassis of solid wood serves as the foundation. Upon this, a round domed framework of willow or birch saplings is erected, forming a spacious yurt. This frame is then covered in thick, overlapping layers of felt, a material manufactured from the tribe's own wool, beaten, wetted, and pressed into a dense, weatherproof, and insulating fabric. This felt, often the color of pale stone or dun earth, is lashed tight against the wind with leather ropes. From a distance, the migrating Auo looks like a slow-moving village of gray, domed hills. To move through this awl is to be immersed in a world of powerful, overlapping sensations. The air is thick with smoke, but it is not the sharp, woody smoke of a forest people. It is the acrid, slightly sweet and pervasive smoke of dried animal dung, the only fuel available in the treeless expanse, a constant plume rising from the portable hearths kept in the wagons or from the open fires of the evening camp. This smoke mingles with the rich, deep odor of livestock, the dusty, oily scent of sheep's wool, the warm, grassy breath of cattle, and the sharp, clean sweat of the horses. There is the smell of leather being cured, a raw chemical tang, and the ever-present sour-sweet aroma of kumis, the fermented mare's milk, bubbling in a skin bag tied to a wagon's side, the day's motion churning it. Life is lived in public, in the open space between the wagons. Women, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their hair in long, thick braids, move with purpose. They are the mistresses of these rolling homes. Some sit high on the driver's benches, their hands holding the long goads for the oxen, their voices calling out in a sharp, clear tongue. Others walk beside the wagons, mending leather harnesses, stitching new felt patches, or spinning wool on a drop spindle as they move. Children, seemingly oblivious to the motion, dart between the great turning wheels, their laughter a high, sharp counterpoint to the lowing of the cattle. They play games with knuckle bones, or practice with small, unstrung bows, their lives already entwined with the two great Sarmatian skills, the horse and the arrow. The herds are not separate from the Aul. They are its lifeblood, a great moving river of flesh that flows alongside and behind it. The constant, deep-throated lowing of the cattle is a sound of contentment and wealth, a reassurance of their existence. Herders on horseback, both men and women, weave in and out of the flanks of the herds, their long lariats in hand, their bodies moving in perfect, fluid unison with their mounts. They are the guardians of the tribe's riches, their eyes constantly scanning for stragglers, for the telltale sign of a wolf in a distant ravine, or for the quality of the grass ahead. The sound of their calls, the barking of their shaggy, broad-headed herding dogs, and the bleating of countless sheep create a complex, living orchestra. This is a world that wakes before the sun. The first chill light sees the Aawel already stirring, the fires rekindled, the morning meal of dried meat and soured milk consumed. The oxen are yoked, their great, placid heads lowered. The kibitkas, which had been arranged in a defensive circle or line for the night, are guided back into the long column of the march. The migration begins, slow and steady, throughout the day. It is a pace dictated by the grazing animals, which must eat as they move. The mule moves at the speed of the slowest calf, the oldest ox. This slow, steady pace belies the military power of the tribe. Far ahead, out of sight and fanning out for miles on the flanks, are the riders, the scouts, the hunters, and the warriors, their swift horses a stark contrast to the plodding oxen. They are the owl's nerve endings, its eyes and its fangs, and they are the ones who move at the speed of the wind. As dusk approaches, the led wagons find a suitable spot, a place with water and good grass. The wagons are circled once more, the animals driven into the protected center. The fires bloom, the sound of the creaking wheels ceases, and for a few hours, the moving city rests, a small, warm circle of life under the vast, starry emptiness of the steppe sky. Within the moving city of wagons, amidst the lowing of cattle and the constant percussive groan of the axles, another sound asserts itself, sharp, metallic, and rhythmic. It is the ring of a smith's hammer. It comes from a space set apart, where the air is hotter, charged with the acrid smoke of a charcoal forge, its flames fanned by a large groaning bellows made of hide. Here in this portable workshop, the defensive power of the Aol is being forged, and an idea is being hammered into a terrible material reality. This is the birthplace of the cataphract, the armored fist of the Sarmatian people, an evolutionary leap in the ancient calculus of war. The smith, his face and arms slick with sweat and soot, is a figure of immense importance, a master of the transformative power of fire. The raw material, iron, is precious, acquired through the long-distance trade of the Iorsi, or as plunder, or as tribute from the cities on the Black Sea. It arrives as ingots or scrap, and here it is reborn. The smith heats a piece of this metal in the glowing heart of the forge until it shines with the light of the sun, then draws it out. The hammer falls, clang, clang, and clang, a steady, forceful beat, flattening the iron, thinning it, spreading it. This is not the work of a swordsmith, forging a single perfect blade. This is the work of mass production. The flattened iron is cut and punched, creating hundreds, then thousands, of small, uniform scales. They are shaped like leaves, or perhaps rounded at one end like the scales of a fish, each one pierced with small holes for stitching. These scales, dark and oily, are then passed to another artisan, the leather worker, whose hands are calloused by the awl and the sinew thread. A heavy, sleeveless tunic is made, not from cloth, but from thick, cured leather or multiple layers of pressed, hardened felt. Then the meticulous assembly begins. Each iron scale is sewn or laced onto this backing, its holes aligned. The pattern is crucial. Each new row is staggered, overlapping the row below it, so that the rounded end of one scale covers the joint and stitching of the two scales beneath it. The result is a flexible, interlocking coat of metal, a lorica squamata, that is almost impervious to the cut of a sword or the bite of an arrow. This is the tam, the cuirass, a garment of iron that can weigh 40 pounds or more, covering the rider from his shoulders to his knees. But the armor does not end there. The rider's transformation must be total. His head is covered by a conical, pointed helmet, often forged from a single piece of iron or bronze, sometimes with a long nasal guard or protective cheek plates, leaving only his eyes visible. His arms, the arms that must hold the great lance, are encased in articulated sleeves of smaller scales, a manica of metal. His legs are protected by greaves of similar construction, or by heavy leather boots stitched with iron plates. When he is fully dressed, the man has vanished, replaced by a moving metallic statue, an iron man whose every step is a heavy, metallic rasp and jingle. This is a tremendous burden, a suffocating weight that makes movement on foot an agonizing, clumsy effort. This vulnerability is the key to the final, most crucial innovation. The Sarmatians understood that an unhorsed cataphract was a dead man. The solution was simple and revolutionary. The horse, too, must be armored. The smith and the leather worker collaborate to create a panoply for the large, powerful steppe charger. A chamfron, a metal mask, protects the horse's head, its eyes and ears open. A great tamen, a body covering of overlapping scales, just like the rider's, or of thick, boiled, and hardened leather, is draped over the animal's neck, chest, and flanks. This armor makes the mount a moving fortress, impervious to the javelins and arrows that would fell a lighter armored cavalry. This new composite creature, this iron man fused to his iron beast, cannot fight in the old way. The composite bow, the ancestral weapon of the steppe, is now a secondary concern, difficult to draw in the heavy armor. This warrior is forged for a single terrible purpose, the charge. He carries the contos, the two-handed lance, a massive spear of ash or cornel wood, 12 to 15 feet in length, tipped with a brutal, armor-piercing head. He wedges it under his arm, holding it with both hands, a human spike extending from a 1-ton battering ram. The smith steps back from the forge. The fire dies down, the sound of the hammer ceases, leaving only the sound of the wind. A new rider, his armor gleaming like the dark scales of a serpent, mounts his protected horse. The earth trembles slightly under the new weight. The cataphract is born, a promise of shock, and the sound of the steppe is about to change forever. The great roaring forge of the cataphract smith, with its sound of percussive violence and its heat, is not the only fire in the Aul. In the quiet, protected space of another kibitka, a different kind of artisan holds court, a master of a smaller, more intense flame. This is the goldsmith, the jeweler, a creator whose work is not of iron and defense, but of gold and belief. The air in this wagon home is not filled with the soot of the forge, but with the faint, sharp smell of melting resin, beeswax, and the clean, metallic scent of heated gold. Here in the dim, felt-walled light, a new artistic language is being given form, a style that speaks of the tribe's wealth, its connection to the supernatural, and its surprising new reach into the far corners of the world. The foundation of this art is ancient, an inheritance from the Scythian masters and the ancestors who buried the golden stags at Filipovka. It is the animal style, a grammar of art based entirely on the animal world, both real and imagined. But the Sarmatians, particularly those like the Aorsi, who sat astride the world's trade routes, were no longer content with the pure, austere light of gold alone. Their art began to hunger for color, for a vibrancy that matched their own dynamic spirit. And so, from the caravans arriving from the east, they acquired the colors of the earth, the stones of distant mythical lands, and began to fuse them with their native golden forms. This was the birth of the polychrome style. The artisan works by the light of a flickering oil lamp, his tools small and precise. He holds a piece of hammered gold, perhaps the fibula that will clasp a warrior's heavy cloak. He has already worked the gold, using the repoussé technique to raise the image from the reverse side, creating a creature in high relief. It is a griffin, the classic guardian of the steppe, its lion body tensed, its eagle head turned back in a fierce, protective cry. But the form is hollowed, divided by tiny, intricate walls of gold wire that the artisan has painstakingly soldered into place. These cells, these cloisons, form a delicate skeletal map of the creature's body, waiting to be filled. On a leather cloth beside him lie the materials of this new art. There is lapis lazuli, a deep celestial blue, flecked with glittering pyrite, like a piece of the night sky. This stone has traveled 1,000 miles, passed from hand to hand from the high remote mountains of Badakhshan in what is now Afghanistan. Beside it lies carnelian, a warm, translucent blood orange gathered from riverbeds in Persia or India. And there is turquoise, the color of the sky on a perfect summer morning, mined from the deserts of Khorasan. These are not just stones, they are condensed pieces of the world, fragments of distant landscapes carried on the backs of camels to this yurt in the middle of the grass sea. The artisan selects a piece of turquoise. With a small, flint-tipped drill, he patiently works the stone, shaping it, grinding its edges, until it fits perfectly into one of the golden cells on the griffin's wing. It is set in place, held by a small dab of resin. He repeats the process, cell by cell, a patient mosaic-like assembly. He sets a tiny, perfectly round cabochon of carnelian for the creature's eye, which seems to ignite with a fierce, red light. The deep blue lapis fills the cells of the body, a stark, cold contrast to the warmth of the gold. The result is a spectacular explosion of color, a piece of art that is both barbaric and deeply sophisticated. The griffin is no longer just a form. It is a constellation of light and color, a heavy, precious object that feels alive in the hand. This style was applied to everything. It was not an art for temples or palaces, but an art for the body and the horse. The Kantos wielding cataphract, encased in his iron scales, was also a glittering canvas. His long iron sword had a hilt and scabbard encased in gold and inlaid with these same stones. Plaques showing coiled boars or stags, their antlers branching into intricate spirals, were sewn onto his tunic and the high leather boots. Even his horse, the other half of his warrior soul, was adorned. The bridle, the cheek pieces, the great round discs at the junction of the straps, were all masterpieces of this polychrome style, the deep reds and blues glowing against the dark, sweaty leather and the horse's flank. This art was a map of the Sarmatian cosmos. The animals were not mere decoration, they were spirits, totems, and guardians. The contorted, swirling forms, predators attacking prey, animals twisted back upon themselves in a flying gallop, spoke of a world of constant, violent, and cyclical energy. It was the energy of the steppe itself, captured in gold and stone. As the fire in the kibitka dies down to embers, the artisan holds the finished griffin up. The firelight catches the polished gold and the deep, cold colors of the stones. It is a portable treasure, a piece of light and power that will ride with its owner across the grass sea, a testament to a people who lived at the center of the world, gathering its beauty and hammering it into the shape of their own fierce dreams. The great moving awl of wagons, the smoking forges, the glittering polychrome-laden warriors, All of it is a response to the landscape, a way of inhabiting the endless, featureless sea of grass. But what of the soul? Where, in this vast horizontal world, does the spirit find a place to kneel? There are no temples here, no soaring columns of marble, no vast shadowy halls, no golden statues of anthropomorphic gods. The Sarmatians, a people in constant motion, built no permanent homes for their deities. To do so would be to chain the gods to a single patch of earth, an idea as alien as the wall of a city. Their temple was the sky itself, their sanctuary the wind, and their altar was as stark, as functional, and as deadly as their way of life. The ancient writers, peering into the grasslands, noted this with a kind of awe. The people of the steppe, they wrote, worshipped the wind and the blade. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing later of the Alans, the final Sarmatian wave, captured the essence of this faith in a single, powerful image. The Sarmatians, he said, did not seek out a grove or a consecrated building. Instead, by a custom that was ancient and unadorned, they would find a clear, open patch of steppe. Here they would thrust a naked iron sword, a long blade of the kind they carried into battle, deep into the earth. And this sword, standing solitary against the horizon, they would worship as Mars, the god of war. It was not a symbol of the god, it was the god itself, the physical manifestation of the divine, a conduit of the sky's power planted firmly in the world of mortals. Imagine this scene. The AOL has paused, the wagons drawn into a great circle, the herds grazing peacefully on the distant slopes. The tribe, perhaps thousands strong, has gathered in a vast, silent crescent. Before them, there is only the grass and the sky. In the center of this sacred space stands the altar. It might be a great high mound of brushwood, as Herodotus described for the Scythians, or perhaps, in the treeless plains, simply a raised mound of earth. At its apex, pointing straight to the heavens, is the sword. It is an old blade, its iron pitted by rust and weather, its hilt perhaps wrapped in worn leather, its edge still sharp enough to sing in the wind. The sound it makes is a low, vibrational hum, the only voice in the great, empty cathedral of the plains. The worship is direct, without the intermediary of a complex robed priesthood, though shamans or wise women may guide the rites. The tribe stands before the blade. They do not kneel or prostrate themselves. They stand as warriors, facing their god with a kind of respectful familiarity. This is the deity that rides with them into battle, the power that guides the contos and hardens the iron scales. The sky above is its true temple, and the wind blowing across the grass is its only hymn. The air is cold, carrying the scent of dry earth and the distant herds. The sun, a low, wintry disk, glints a cold, hard light from the wetness of the blade, which is not from rain. The sacrifice is not of incense or wine. It is a sacrifice of blood, the currency of a martial faith. Horses, the most valuable possession of any warrior, the soul of the steppe, are led forward. Their manes are braided, their coats brushed, they are the finest of the herd. With a swift, practiced movement, their throats are cut, and their hot, dark blood spills out, steaming in the cold air. It pours onto the mound, soaking the earth at the base of the iron sword, a physical offering, a feeding of the god. Cattle and sheep, too, are offered, their lives given to nourish the divine power that ensures the tribe's survival. The Sarmatians would feast on the consecrated meat, sharing a communal meal with their god, a god who was not a distant abstraction, but a tangible presence, a piece of forged iron drinking the blood of their herds. This faith, centered on the sword in the earth, is the spiritual spine of the Sarmatian world. It is a belief system perfectly aligned with their existence. When your life is defined by the blade, the tool that hunts, that defends the Aeul, that wins new pastures, and that brings you honor, it is only natural to see that blade as the ultimate power. It is a faith of brutal honesty, stripped of all philosophical artifice. It is the worship of the act, of the edge, of the cold, hard fact of survival. As the tribe prepares to move on, the sword is left behind, a lone sentinel in the vastness, a permanent marker of a temporary stop, its iron point a silent testament to the vertical axis of belief in a world defined in all other ways by the endless, wandering horizontal line. From the open, wind-scoured steppe, where the only altar is a sword driven into the earth, the camera moves south, its gaze drifting over the coastal plains until it reaches the turquoise, sun-glinting waters of the Euxine Sea, the Black Sea. It travels east, past the Crimean Peninsula, to the narrow, restless strait known as the Cimmerian Bosporus, the gateway between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Here, the landscape of the nomad ceases, and a new world, one of stone and commerce, rises from the shore. This is the Bosporan Kingdom, a realm of ancient Greek cities, Panticapaeum on the west, Phanagoria on the east, that have clung to these shores for centuries. Their stone-built acropolises rise above deep harbors, their flanks dotted with the white marble columns of Hellenic temples. The air here does not smell of dry grass and horse. It smells of sea salt, olives, fish, and the sweet, fermented scent of wine from 1,000 amphorae. For generations, this kingdom had been a hybrid, a place where Greek colonists and merchants lived in a tense, profitable symbiosis with the Scythian lords of the interior. The city artisans, trained in the workshops of Athens, had become masters of crafting the exquisite, naturalistic gold artifacts that the Scythian kings craved, depicting their patrons' lives with Hellenic grace. The kingdom's wealth, the coin that paid for its marble and its fleets, was the vast golden river of Scythian grain, funneled from the black earth steppe, loaded onto ships in these harbors, and sent to feed the cities of the Mediterranean. The kings of Panticapaeum had long styled themselves as Greek rulers, yet they were also masters of a barbarian domain. But the Scythian twilight, the slow fading of their power, had changed the calculus of this kingdom. The pressure from the east, which had pushed the Iazygs to the Danube, had also pressed new peoples against the Bosporan frontiers. The Sarmatians, specifically the powerful Saraces, had become the new dominant force in the plains just outside the city walls. They did not, at first, come as conquerors to tear down the stone. They came as they always had, as traitors, as mercenaries, and as allies. They were the new partners, the new power that the Greek kings had to appease, to hire, and increasingly to obey. The process was slow, an infiltration rather than an invasion. Sarmatian cavalry commanders, with their Draco standards and polychrome jewelry, became a common sight in the agora of Panticapaeum. Sarmatian nobles began to marry into the Bosporan aristocracy, their steppe blood mixing with the old lines of Greek colonists. Inevitably, the power behind the throne became the power on the throne. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the names of the kings themselves tell the story. Rulers emerge bearing names like Aspergus, Sarmatians, and Rescoporus, names that resonate not with the cadences of Athens, but with the harsh, sibilant sounds of the Iranian steppe. A new Sarmatian dynasty had taken control. The king who now sat on the Hellenistic throne in the palace of Pantikapaeum was a man of two worlds, a living paradox. He might be found in the morning, dressed in a purple silk-embroidered Greek chiton, his head crowned with a golden diadem, discussing shipping manifests and the price of wheat with his Greek administrators. His Greek was fluent, his understanding of maritime law precise. But in the afternoon, the same king might receive a delegation of his nomadic cousins from the plains. The Greek robes would be cast aside for the soft leather boots, wide trousers, and the richly decorated caftan of a Sarmatian noble. He would sit not on a delicate chair, but on a rich carpet, sharing fermented kumis with his kin, speaking his native Iranian tongue. His personal bodyguard, clanking on the palace's mosaic floors, was not a hoplite phalanx, but a squadron of his own cataphracts, their iron scale armor a stark, threatening presence against the painted stucco walls. His power was a delicate, brilliant fusion. He commanded the loyalty of the steppe warriors, the true military might of his kingdom, and he controlled the vast taxable and self-replenishing wealth of the Greek merchant cities. This blend was most profound in how these kings chose to face eternity. When they died, they were not buried in the open steppe, beneath a simple kurgan. They were interred in magnificent, stone-built tombs, vaulted chambers dug into the hillsides, their walls covered in elaborate colorful frescoes depicting Greek myths or scenes of daily life. Yet inside this Hellenic chamber, the funeral was pure steppe. The king was laid to rest not with a lyre, but with his long iron sword, his composite bow, and a full set of his finest polychrome animal-style jewelry. And in a chamber nearby, or at the entrance, his favorite war horses were ritually sacrificed and buried with him, their bridles still glittering with carnelian and gold, ready to carry their master into the afterlife. This kingdom, a fusion of Hellenic stone and Sarmatian steel, had become a new, stable, and powerful entity, a fixed point of Sarmatian influence that would endure for centuries, a hybrid civilization born of the sea and the grass. The Danube frontier, where the Iazyges had come to rest, was no longer a quiet, two-sided affair, a simple line between Roman order and nomadic freedom. By the dawn of the 2nd century of the Common Era, a new, formidable power had consolidated in the high forested mountains to the east. This was Dacia, a kingdom not of wagons, but of stone fortresses, a confederation of tribes united by a leader of singular genius and will, a King Decebalus. He was not a raider. He was a state builder. His muri dacici, great fortresses of timber and rock, looked down from the Carpathian passes, and his workshops, supplied with Roman deserters and engineers, were forging Roman-style weapons. He had defied the empire, and Rome, under its new, ambitious, and utterly pragmatic soldier emperor Trajan, would not let the challenge stand. The Iazyges, in their Pannonian pastures, were suddenly caught in the shadow of a truly seismic conflict. They were no longer the primary barbarian threat. They were now a critical and volatile third player. Decebalus, a canny diplomat as well as a warrior, saw the Iazyges cavalry as the perfect complement to his own mountain infantry. He courted them, sought their alliance, offered them gold and promises of plunder, appealing to their shared desire to see the Roman eagles humbled. The Iazyges, for their part, saw an opportunity. To join Dacia was to be part of a grand coalition, a chance to strike a blow against the limes that had contained them, and to win a war that could redefine the entire frontier. The alliance was sealed. The Iazyges, with their heavy lances and dragon standards, pledged their horsemen to the Dacian king. Trajan's response was not a punitive raid. It was an act of continental re-engineering. This was the Roman war machine at its most terrifying, a methodical, logistical colossus. The emperor did not simply march his legions to the Danube. He commanded the architect Apollodorus of Damascus to build a bridge over it. A permanent, massive structure of stone, wood, and concrete, a thing of impossible scale, it was designed to walk the legions across the water as if it were dry land. Roads were cut through dense, ancient forests. Forts were built, supply lines established, and siege engines of immense size were trundled forward on heavy carts. This was a war of infrastructure, a war of shovels and axes as much as swords, and it was a type of war for which the Iazyges had no answer. But the war still had to be fought in the field. As the legions pushed into Dacia, fanning out into the valleys, Decebalus unleashed his allies. The Iazyges riders, their horses fresh from the Pannonian grass, thundered out from the cover of the wooded foothills. They were a shocking sight to the Roman columns, who were prepared for the grim, scythe-wielding Dacian foot soldiers. Instead, they were met by the familiar, dreadful sound of the Draco standard hissing in the wind and the percussive, earth-shaking rumble of a heavy cavalry charge. The Iazyges did not ride as full cataphracts, perhaps their horses not as heavily armored as their Roxolani cousins, but they were heavy lancers, a wall of iron-tipped contos spears moving at a gallop. The target was often a Roman auxiliary cohort, perhaps a unit of Gauls or Batavians, tasked with guarding a flank or a supply convoy. The auxiliary commanders, seasoned veterans of the frontier, would hear the charge coming. The orders were shouted, the Latin sharp and clear, Clinit, Scuta, Pila. The legionaries and auxiliaries formed a wall of shields, a testudo on foot. They braced themselves, the front rank kneeling, their long haste spears pointing out at an angle, the ranks behind them standing, their shields locked, their pila, heavy javelins, held in their right hands, ready to throw. The air grew thick with the sound of thousands of hooves, then the crash. The Iazyges' lances hit the shield wall with the force of a falling tree. The sound was a sickening splintering of wood, a screech of metal on metal, and the screams of men and horses. The Contos' lances, held with two hands, punched through the curved wooden scuta, shattering the shields and the bones behind them. The sheer kinetic impact of the charge was designed to break the line, to shatter the infantry's cohesion and ride them down. But this was not a disorganized levy. This was a Roman-trained army. The line buckled, it groaned, but in many places it held. The men who fell were replaced by the men behind them. The Iazyges' horses, shying from the wall of spears, and the pila that were now thrown in a volley at point-blank range, began to rear and turn. The charge had broken against a wall of disciplined auxiliary infantry. The Iazyges, their primary weapon blunted, were now a frustrated, milling mass of horsemen, too close to the Roman lines, their long lances useless in the close quarters melee. Roman archers, perhaps from Syria, loosed volley after volley into their ranks from the flanks. The Iazyges, masters of the open field, were trapped in a brutal, grinding fight against an enemy that did not break. They took heavy losses and were forced to pull back, their Draco standards retreating over the rise, leaving the ground littered with their dead and wounded, the earth churned to mud by the desperate struggle. This scene was repeated time and again. The Sarmatian cavalry, for all its terror, could not stop Trajan's methodical advance. They could not stop the siege engines from being assembled before the Dacian forts. They could not ride down a legion that had formed its defensive square. They were a force of the open plain, pulled into a war of mountains, sieges, and engineering. As Trajan's column in Rome would later depict, the war became a grim, inexorable process of capture and dismantling, one fortress at a time. The Iazyges, their alliance with Decebalus now a fatal liability, watched as the Dacian kingdom was extinguished. They had been caught in Trajan's war, and by betting on the losing side, they had earned the focused and very long-memoried enmity of Rome. The fleeting, violent shock of the Dacian wars had settled into a long, grinding ache on the frontier, a permanent state of tension that would last for generations. The Iazyges, having tasted Roman wealth and tested Roman defenses, were no longer a distant threat, but a persistent, immediate danger, a storm system permanently gathered on the Pannonian horizon. Half a century after Trajan's death, this tension finally broke, not in a single focused war, but in a chaotic, desperate conflagration that set the entire northern frontier ablaze. This was the time of the Marcomannic Wars, a great tide of Germanic and Sarmatian peoples, Marcomanni, Quadi, and the Iazyges, all pushing at once against the containing wall of the limes. And the man who stood against this tide was not a soldier emperor like Trajan, but a philosopher, a man of quiet, internal contemplation, forced by destiny to become the anvil of the empire, Marcus Aurelius. He stands on the stone rampart of the great legionary fortress of Carnuntum, the military capital of Pannonia Superior. The winter air is so cold it feels like a physical weight, a painful, crystalline sharpness in the lungs. His breath, like that of the sentries beside him, is a plume of white vapor that is instantly torn away by the wind. He is wrapped not in the imperial purple, but in a thick, dun-colored military cloak, its wool coarse against his skin. He looks east, not at a forest, but at the river. The Danube is gone, its powerful green-gray current stilled, its surface a vast, scarred, and silent highway of gray ice, stretching from his bank to the dark line of the opposite shore. The sky is a low, seamless, and oppressive sheet of lead. Upon this frozen stage, the Iazyges are moving. The emperor watches, his gaze steady, as the dark columns flow out of the mists of Barbaricum. It is not a charge, it is an invasion, a migration of dreadful purpose. They come in their thousands, and then their tens of thousands. The scale is impossible, a living river of horsemen that seems to have no source and no end. The dominant sound is not the war cry, but the deep, percussive, and continuous drumming of innumerable hooves on the hard, resonant ice, a sound like the heartbeat of the frozen earth itself. The Draco standards, the great dragon-headed windsocks, are everywhere, a forest of them, their cloth bodies hissing and snapping in the wind, a high, sibilant counterpoint to the rumble of the hooves. These are the heavy lancers, the kantos wielders, their scale armor and pointed helmets, making them a dark, metallic tide. But they are not alone. With them come the horse archers, lighter and faster, weaving in and out of the heavy columns. And behind them, a vast, dark mass, come the wagons, the awls of the tribe, filled with their women and children, a sign that this is not a raid for plunder, but a war for new lands, a desperate existential push into the heart of the Roman province. They bring with them great, long planks of wood, which they lay across the ice, a crude but effective form of siegecraft, a bridge to assault the Roman forts that line the bank. They are a nation on the attack, and their target is Pannonia, and beyond it, Italy itself. Marcus Aurelius watches this relentless, flowing column, this physical manifestation of the chaos that he, the Stoic, sought to understand and endure. This was the Long War, a conflict that would consume the last 14 years of his life, a grinding, brutal, and seemingly endless struggle fought in the mud of the Pannonian spring and the lethal cold of its winters. The Iazyges cavalry was a different kind of enemy. They were fluid, a deadly, amorphous threat. They would sweep across the frozen Danube, bypass the legionary fortresses, and strike deep into the hinterland. They burned the undefended villas, the great agricultural estates, their smoke a dark stain against the snow. They took captives, tens of thousands of them, as the historian Cassius Dio would later record, a human harvest to be dragged back across the ice. The emperor's response was not one of panic, but of slow, methodical, and grim determination. He raised new legions, the Legio II and the Third Italica, to plug the gaps in the bleeding frontier. He spent years here, not in a palace, but in the field, in his campaign quarters at Carnuntum or Aquincum, directing the grim logistics of a total war. His legions would counterattack, crossing the ice themselves, pursuing the Sarmatian raiders into their own marshy homelands, a slow, punishing war of attrition. But time, which wears down stone and steel, also wears down the human spirit. The long war was a thing of profound weariness, a struggle of endurance against a foe who seemed as limitless as the grass from which they came. The philosopher emperor continues to stand on the wall, the wind pulling at his cloak. The Iazyges columns are still coming, a dark, articulated serpent of men and horses, moving with a terrible, patient certainty across the ice. The Roman trumpets, the cornu, sound a low, warning note from the towers, a brazen, mournful sound in the frozen air. The legions are forming up behind the walls, the metallic scrape of their armor, the sharp Latin commands. But the emperor just watches. He is observing the collision of two worlds, the hard line of the Roman fort and the endless, fluid motion of the steppe, and it is here, in the cold, at the edge of the world, that he will write his Meditations, a book about finding serenity in the very heart of this overwhelming, chaotic storm. The ice groans under the weight of the coming war, and the sun is a pale, indifferent disk, barely visible through the frigid mist. The long, grinding war with Marcus Aurelius was not a single continuous campaign fought only on the frozen Danube. It was a seasonal agony, a conflict that ebbed and flowed with the weather, and the summer on the Pannonian plain was just as formidable an enemy as the winter. The camera moves away from the icebound river, inland, deep into the territory of the Quadi, the Iazigis Germanic allies. The month is July, and the sun is a merciless, white-hot eye in a sky of bleached, cloudless blue. A Roman legion, the Legio Utuine Fulminata, the Thundering Legion, is trapped here, deep in hostile territory. It is a column of perhaps 5,000 men, a disciplined, segmented serpent of iron and leather, but it is dying. They are not dying from the spears of the enemy. They are dying of thirst. They have been cut off, lured by a feigned retreat into a dry, waterless basin, a natural cauldron walled by low, rocky hills. The earth is not mud. It is a fine, pale dust that rises in choking clouds with every agonizing step, a powder that coats their tongues, cracks their lips, and grinds against their teeth. The heat is a physical, suffocating presence, a heavy, shimmering blanket that presses down on them. The sun beats on their iron helmets, the Galea, turning them into small, personal ovens. The Lorica segmentata, the plates of their armor, are burning hot to the touch, searing their skin through the thick, sweat-soaked woolen tunics beneath. The sounds are all wrong. There is no marching rhythm, no legionary song, no casual, profane banter of the barracks. There is only the dry, metallic clank of armor, the heavy, rhythmic thud of the pila and scuda being dragged, and the desperate, rasping sound of 5,000 men breathing dust. The Aquilifer, the eagle-bearer, a man of immense strength and pride, can barely hold the golden standard aloft. The eagle seems to droop, its metal wings a dead weight. The centurions, their faces grim and streaked with salty white lines of dried sweat, have stopped shouting. Discipline, the soul of the legion, is dissolving into a common animal agony. When the enemy is watching, on the low, sun-baked ridges that encircle the basin, the Iazigis and Quadi are a dark, patient, and shimmering line. The Sarmatian lancers are unmistakable, their contos spears a forest of vertical lines against the sky, their Draco standards hanging limp in the still, hot air. They do not charge. They have no need. They are masters of this landscape, and they know the sun is their greatest ally. They have driven away the game, fouled the last known well, and now they simply wait, a ring of silent, dark horsemen, watching the greatest army in the world bake to death in its own iron shell. Their patience is a more profound terror than any charge. The Roman column has halted. Men are collapsing, falling out of rank, their bodies simply giving up. The horses of the small cavalry detachment stand with their heads low, their flanks heaving. Marcus Aurelius is not here. The legion is on its own. The officers gather in a desperate, silent council. They are at the end. Surrender is not an option. It will mean either slaughter or a life in slavery worse than death. There is only the end here in this bowl of dust. Then a change. It is not a sound, but a feeling. The light in the basin, the relentless white glare, seems to subtly dim. The oppressive, motionless air stirs, a single cool puff of wind that carries not dust, but a new, strange smell, the smell of ozone, of damp earth. A soldier, his face turned to the sky in a rictus of despair, sees it first. On the western horizon, where there was only blue, a new line has appeared. It is a deep, bruised, and violent purple, a cloud building with an impossible, unnatural speed. The distant line of Sarmatian horsemen is suddenly silhouetted against this rising, monstrous darkness. A low, distant rumble, like 1,000 wagons on a stone road, vibrates in the earth. The Thundering Legion. The wind is no longer a puff. It is a sudden, cold gale, a physical blow that rips the dust from the ground in great, spiraling dervishes. The sky is torn open by a jagged, white-hot line of lightning, and the crack of thunder that follows is not a rumble, but an explosion, a sound so loud it hurts the ears. And with it comes the rain. It is not a rain, but a deluge, a vertical river falling from the sky. The first drops are the size of sling stones, hitting the hot armor with a hiss and the dry ground with a puff of dust. A second later, the world is gone, dissolved in a curtain of white, driving water. For the legion, it is a resurrection. The sound of despair is replaced by a vast, hoarse, and unbelieving roar. Men are shouting, weeping, laughing. They rip off their galea, their helmets, and turn their faces to the sky, the water washing the dust and despair away. They hold out their shields, the concave scuta, which become shallow bowls, and they drink the muddy, life-giving water from them. They are reborn. But for the Iazyges on the ridge, the miracle is a disaster. The same storm that saves the legion grounds them. The baked dry plain, the hard, fast ground that is their element, transforms in minutes into a deep, sucking, and treacherous quagmire. The fine, dry soil becomes a thick, sort of glue-like mud. Their horses, the great chargers of the steppe, are bogged down, their hooves sinking deep, their legs plastered with the heavy brown ooze. They slip, they panic, they cannot build a charge. Mobility, their soul, their tactic, their very essence is gone. They are suddenly transformed from apex predators into helpless, stuck figures. The Roman legion, its thirst slaked, its strength returned by the fulminata, the thundering bolt, lifts its eagle. The legionaries, now standing on firm ground, watches their tormentors are trapped in the very earth that was an hour before their accomplice. The miracle of the rain, as Cassius Dio would record it, had saved the legion and broken the Sarmatian charge before it could even begin. The miracle of the rain, the divine and terrible intervention, was not the end of the war, but a turning point, a sign that the gods, or fortune, had tilted toward Rome. The long, grinding attrition of Marcus Aurelius's campaigns, his relentless pressure, his methodical, suffocating logistics, and the sheer, inexhaustible manpower of the legions finally did what no single battle could. The Iazyges, their strength bled away in a dozen campaigns, their pastures burned, their herds thinned, were broken. The Quadi and Marcomanni, their Germanic allies, had sued for a separate, exhausted peace. The great barbarian coalition that had set the Danube ablaze had been systematically and pitilessly dismantled. The scene of the surrender is not one of triumphalism, but of grim, imperial business. It takes place on the Pannonian plain, not far from the Danube, the air still carrying the chill of a new winter. Marcus Aurelius, his philosopher's face etched with the weariness of a decade of war, sits on a raised tribunal. Below him, the Iazyges nobility, the kings and chieftains, have dismounted. Their polychrome inlaid armor is dulled by weather and defeat, their long hair matted. They have come to hear the terms. The terms are harsh, the price of their survival. They must withdraw from the banks of the Danube, ceding a wide 10-mile buffer zone, a no-man's land to be patrolled by Roman numeri. They must, as Cassius Dio records, return the tens of thousands of Roman captives they had dragged away in their raids, a vast, shuffling column of human misery that would soon begin its own long journey home. But there is one final, crucial stipulation. It is the price of blood, the foedus, the treaty that will turn a defeated enemy into a servant of the empire. The Iazyges must provide a contingent of auxiliaries to the Roman army. Not a few hundred scouts, but a massive levy, a significant portion of their remaining military strength. The number is specified, precise, and devastating: 8,000 horsemen. This is the figure that would be negotiated, a number that represented the very flower of their tribe. Of these, a specific group, a hand-picked corps of the heaviest, most formidable lancers, was to be separated for a special fate. The number that history would remember was 5,500. This was not a recruitment drive. It was a culling. 5,500 of the best Iazyges riders, the masters of the cantos, the men who had charged the Roman shield walls, were to be handed over. They were to be formed into a new, massive auxiliary unit, an ala unlike any other. They were allowed, and indeed ordered, to keep their equipment, their iron scale armor, their conical helms, their long lances, and their terrifying Draco standards. Rome was not just taking prisoners. It was appropriating a weapon system. It was absorbing the shock cavalry of the steppe and turning it into an instrument of imperial policy. The mustering is a scene of profound, quiet sorrow. In the great halls, the women keen, a high, thin, wailing sound that carries on the cold wind. The chosen riders, their faces impassive, prepare their mounts, not for a raid, but for a journey of exile. They bid farewell to their families, to the wagon homes they will never see again, to the endless flat horizon that is the only world they have ever known. Then they assemble, a vast, dark river of iron and horseflesh, and begin their march. They are now the alla prima Sarmatarum. Their journey is a slow, relentless movement, not across the open grass, but through the hard, ordered, and alien anatomy of the Roman Empire. They ride in a disciplined column, flanked by Roman legionaries, their journey a spectacle for the settled people of the provinces. They follow the stone-topped military roads, their horses' hooves striking a hard, ringing sound so different from the soft thud on the steppe. They pass the great legionary fortresses of Carnuntum and Vindobona, cities of stone, tile, and bathhouses. They cross the Alps, a landscape of crushing vertical stone, a terrifying world of peaks and precipices that seems to press in on men born to the infinite horizontal. They move through the tamed, forested, and farmed landscapes of Gaul, a patchwork of fields and walled towns. They finally arrive at the coast, at Gassoriacum, the Roman port of Boulogne. Here, they are met by a sight that defies their cosmology. They see the Oceanus, the great, gray, and boundless sea. It is not the familiar, tideless Euxine, but a vast, cold, and restless body of water, its surface heaving with the tide, the air thick with the smell of salt and cold spray. Roman transport ships, once broad, functional vessels, are waiting in the harbor, their sails reefed. The order is given. Their destination is the end of the world, Britannia. This is the place Roman soldiers themselves viewed as a posting of grim, misty exile, an island of perpetual rain, inhabited by savage, blue-painted tribes. It is the ultimate expression of their defeat, their removal from the world. The horses, terrified by the shifting wooden ramps and the smell of the sea, are loaded into the dark, cramped holds. The warriors follow, their heavy scale armor clanking on the decks, and with them they carry their standards. The great dragon-headed banners, the dracones, are taken down from their poles and carried onto the ships. The dragon standards are being sent west, a piece of the steppe world torn from its roots, to be carried across the water to an island of mist and stone, a place as far from the grass sea as the moon. The crossing of the Oceanus was a gray, heaving misery. The horses, sick and terrified, were stalled in the dark, pitching holds of the transport ships, their cries a muffled, painful sound beneath the decks. The warriors, their heavy scale armor packed in chests, huddled in their damp wool cloaks, their bodies unaccustomed to the relentless cold motion of the sea. They were men of the grass ocean, and this saltwater ocean was a chaotic, alien, and deeply unsettling element. After days, a new, long, and low shadow appeared on the northern horizon. It was not the pale cliffs of Dubris, but the green, wet shoreline of the north. They had arrived at the edge of the world, Britannia. The disembarkation was into a new reality. The air was not dry, it was liquid. A fine, persistent mist, a drizz that was not quite rain, hung in the air, clinging to every surface, chilling the skin, and soaking their leather tunics. The smell was not of dust, thyme, and horse, but of cold salt spray, rotting seaweed, and damp, heavy earth. And the color. The world was a shocking, overwhelming, and almost violent green. It was not the subtle, seasonal olive and gold of the steppe, but a deep, wet, and saturated viridescence, a land of dense forests, moss-covered stone, and fields of grass that were a dark, heavy emerald, unnervingly lush. Their new posting was not in the civilized, Romanized south, but in the deep, unsettled north. The Alla Prima Sarmatarum began its last march, a long journey up the Roman military road. The landscape was claustrophobic. The road, a hard, stone-topped ribbon, cut through dense, ancient forests of oak and yew, a dark, dripping canopy that blocked the sky. This was a vertical world, a world of hills, valleys, and sudden rocky fells that rose into the low, weeping clouds. For a man born to the endless flat horizon, this enclosure was a form of psychic imprisonment, a land without a view, a land that felt as if it were constantly pressing in, suffocating the spirit. They arrived finally at their destination, their permanent garrison, Bremetenicum Vetranorum, the fort that would one day be called Ribchester. It was a place of grim Roman functionality, a square of stone walls, ditches, and wooden ramparts set above the bend of a dark, fast-flowing river. This was their new home and their new prison. Their duty was to guard this sector of the northern frontier, to be the heavy cavalry, the fist that patrolled the high wild country of the Pennine Fells, to watch for the raids of the Picts and the rebellious Brigantes, the blue-painted tribes of the mist. And so, the most alien sight in the history of Roman Britain came to be. The Draco standards were unfurled. These great Sarmatian dragon banners, their bronze and iron heads designed to catch the wind, were raised over the gates of a Roman fort in Lancashire. The wind that now filled them was not the dry burin of the steppe, but the damp, heavy western wind blowing in from the Irish Sea. The sound they made was the same, the high, mournful, whistling hiss, a sound designed to terrify, but it was now an echo, a memory of a lost world. The 5,500 lancers, clad in their iron scales, their conical helms gleaming with mist, rode out on patrols, not in a thundering 1,000-man charge, but in small, detached turmi. Their long Kantos lances were ill-suited to this broken, boggy, and forested terrain. But they were what they were, a brotherhood of heavy armored riders, exiles bound by a shared duty and a common distant memory. They served here for decades. This first generation of 5,500 lived and fought and died at Bremetenicum. They took wives from the local Britons, and their children, half Sarmatian, half Celtic, were born as Roman citizens in this damp, misty land. The sharp Iranian cadences of their language slowly softened, blurred by Latin and Brythonic. The dragon standards flew over Ribchester for 40 years, and perhaps longer, the garrison replenished over time. They were a profound, indelible, and deeply strange presence in the memory of the northern fells. A seed of legend had been planted here in the rain. The image of a great commander, a Roman prefect named Lucius Artorius Castus, who would one day command these very Sarmacian alai, and the sight of this elite, heavy cavalry, this band of armored, lance-wielding knights, with their serpent dragon banners, riding out of the mist to do battle. This was a story that would not die. It was an echo, a vibration in the memory of the land, a seed that would sleep for centuries, waiting for a future poet to find it and weave it into a new and greater myth. The historical reality faded. The men were buried in the damp British soil, but the Draco continued to fly, a whisper of the steppe that had settled permanently in the mists of the westernmost isle. The world of the steppe had always been a story of waves, of one people rising and another receding. The Sarmatians themselves had been the new, hard wave that had broken and submerged the Scythians. Now, after centuries of dominance, after testing the Roman limes and planting their dragon standards in the midst of Britain, their own long afternoon had come. The light was changing, the shadows were lengthening, and a new sound was rolling across the plains, not from the familiar, distant east, but from the dark, cold forests of the north. This was the sound of the Goths, a great and terrifying consolidation of a new people, and they were not coming to raid, but to possess. They had not come from Asia. They had, according to their own origin sagas, come from the north, from the mists of Scandinavia, across the Baltic Sea, and then, in a slow generational migration, they had followed the great river roads south. They had trundled their wagons down the Vistula, and then spread, finding the vast arterial waterways of the Dnieper and the Dniester. These rivers led them, as they led all things, to the rich, warm, and waiting shores of the Black Sea. They were not, at first, a nomadic people of the horse, not in the Sarmatian sense. They were a people of the forest, the river, and the farm. They built settlements of timber, they tilled the rich black earth, and they forged a new, hybrid world that archaeologists would one day call the Chernyakov culture. But they were also a people of the sword, and in time, of the ship. They learned with terrifying speed to master their new environment. From their new homes on the Black Sea coast, they built fleets of rough-hewn, shallow-draft boats and became the new terror of the Euxine. They were the sea raiders who now sacked the ancient wealthy cities of the Roman East, Trebizond, Bithynia, even the shores of Attica. But their greatest consolidation was on the land. By the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, they had coalesced from a loose collection of tribes into 2 vast, powerful kingdoms, the Tervini to the west of the Dniester, and the Grutungi to the east. This was the Gothic consolidation. It was not a fluid aeol of wagons. It was a regnum, a kingdom, a vast, settled, and warlike state that now laid claim to the entire Pontic steppe. A great, semi-legendary king named Ermanaric, a figure of awe and dread, was said to rule this new empire, his authority stretching from the Baltic in the north to the Black Sea in the south. This new Gothic power, agricultural, mercantile, and military, now stood as the undisputed master of the old Scythian and Sarmatian heartland, and the Sarmatians, the Roxolani, and the Alans, who still roamed these plains, were suddenly and catastrophically squeezed. They were no longer the dominant power, pressing against the Roman limes. They were now a middle people, a diminishing buffer, trapped between two immense, organized, and hostile states, the Roman Empire to their south, and the new, burgeoning, and aggressive Gothic kingdom to their north and east. The open, endless steppe, the source of their freedom and their fluid power, was gone. It was now a bounded territory, a contested zone, its pastures claimed by Gothic farmers, its rivers controlled by Gothic kings, its trade routes now feeding Gothic treasuries. The Roxolani, their strength long since spent against the Roman anvils on the Danube, were the first to be submerged. They were absorbed, their tribes broken apart, their warriors taking service with the new masters. The Alans, the last great Sarmatian confederation, who had held the lands east of the Dnieper, now found themselves facing a new, powerful neighbor who coveted their lands and their military skill. Their independence, which had been as wide and unquestioned as the sky, was now a matter of daily negotiation. A new, shifting, and desperate set of alliances was born from this pressure. The Sarmatian identity began to fracture. Some Alanic tribes chose resistance, fighting a desperate, losing battle against the Gothic infantry and their own new cavalry. Other Alanic nobles, pragmatic and seeing the new direction of the wind, bent the knee. They became vassals of the Gothic kings. Their heavy cataphract cavalry, the contos and the scale armor, was a weapon the Goths deeply respected and eagerly incorporated. In the great timber-built halls of the Gothic rulers, Sarmatian nobles now sat at the feast tables, their polychrome jewelry glittering strangely in the firelight, next to the heavy, amber-adorned Goths. Their Draco standards were now raised not for their own kings, but for Ermanaric. They had become a warrior caste in a foreign army, their lances now the armored fist of the Gothic consolidation, their fate inextricably, and, as it would prove, tragically, tied to the new lords of the Black Sea. A new sound is born on the far eastern horizon, beyond the Caspian, beyond the lands of the Aorsi, out in the illimitable unknown deserts of deep Asia. It is not a sound the steppe has ever heard before. It is not the low, familiar rumble of the aol, nor the metallic thunder of the cataphract. It is a high-pitched, ululating, and continuous shriek, a sound of 1,000 voices blended into one inhuman wail. It is the sound of a whirlwind given a human throat. This sound, carried on the wind long before the source is seen, is the first herald of the Hunnic storm, and when the source does appear, it is a sight of such alien terror that the foundations of the world seem to crack. They do not move like the Sarmatians, a slow, steady migration of wagons and herds. They move like a plague, a racing, wind-borne fire. They are a people who seem to have been born on horseback, their bodies short, broad, and uncannily fused to their small, ugly, and relentlessly tough ponies. They seem to flow over the land, not on it, a vast, dark, and fluid mass, without the encumbrance of heavy supply trains or plodding oxen. Their warfare is a thing of terrifying speed and calculated chaos. They are the ultimate light cavalry, the masters of the composite bow, which they fire with astonishing speed, accuracy, and power from the saddle, turning, advancing, and retreating in a single, fluid, unpredictable motion. They are a swirling force, a vortex of arrows that closes, kills, and vanishes before a counterstrike can even be formed. They are not ironclad. They wear soft leather, cured hides, and perhaps the strange helmet-like caps made from the skins of field mice, as the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus would later write with a shudder. Their faces, he would report, are so different they seem barely human, their features as if flattened, their eyes small and deep-set. They carry not the long, honorable contos, but the lasso, the rope, which they use to ensnare their enemies and drag them from the saddle. They are, to the settled and even the nomadic world, a force of pure, elemental disruption. They are the other, the ultimate barbarian, arriving from a place beyond all known maps. This storm, in the latter half of the 4th century, around 370 CE, broke first upon the Alans, the last great Sarmatian confederation, who still held the lands east of the Don. The Alanic cataphracts, the heavy iron-scaled lancers, formed their wedges. They prepared for a familiar charge, a shock battle of weight and steel. The Huns did not meet them. They did not form a line. They simply swirled around them, a cloud of stinging, arrow-firing hornets, a blizzard of poisoned shafts that found every gap in the heavy armor. They targeted the horses, the great vulnerable chargers. The cataphract, his mount shot from under him, was left a helpless, stranded, iron-clad turtle to be dispatched with ease. The Hellenic kingdom of the eastern steppe was not defeated. It was annihilated. It was scattered to the winds, its warriors either killed, enslaved, or in a move of pure pragmatism, absorbed into the Hunnic horde, their lances now forced to serve a new, terrifying master. The storm did not pause. It crossed the Tanais, the ancient river boundary, and fell upon the rich, vast, and powerful Gothic kingdom of the Greuthungi, ruled by the aged, formidable king Ermanaric. The Goths, masters of the Black Sea shore, their kingdom a mix of settled farms and military might, were utterly unprepared. Their infantry, the strength of their forest ancestors, was useless against this fluid, mounted on terror. Their own heavy cavalry, ironically provided by their Alan vassals, was now matched and overwhelmed by the sheer, chaotic speed and the arrow storms of the Huns. The Gothic kingdom shattered. Ermanaric's great confederation, which had stretched from sea to sea, dissolved in a matter of months. The sound of the Hunnic wail, the shriek of their charge, broke the nerve of a people who had known no fear. The Greuthungi Goths were sent reeling west, a tide of desperate refugees, pushing their cousins, the Tervini, before them. The entire stable ecosystem of the Pontic steppe, the world of the Goth and the Sarmatian, the world that had defined the Roman frontier for 3 centuries, it was not just changed, it was obliterated. It was shattered, broken into 1,000 pieces, its peoples sent fleeing in a desperate, chaotic diaspora. The Hunnic storm had broken, and in its wake, the old world was gone, drowned in a new, dark, and racing flood. The Alans, Those who had not been killed or absorbed were now a people without a homeland, a nation of refugees on horseback, and their long final migration was about to begin. The air over the Don and the Dnieper is no longer clean, no longer carries the scent of thyme and dry grass. It is thick with the gray, greasy smoke of 1,000 burning awls, a vast, lingering funeral pyre for the Alanic kingdom. The Hunnic storm has passed over like a swarm of locusts, leaving a scoured, silent, and terrified landscape in its wake. The kurgans of the ancestors, the great silent mounds that have watched over the steppe for a millennia, are now under the shadow of a new, alien master. The high, ululating shriek of the Hunnic charge has faded, replaced by a profound, shell-shocked silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the ashes of the wagon homes and the distant, mournful lowing of scattered, masterless cattle. For the Alans, the last great Sarmatian confederation, this is the shattering. They are no longer a people, they are a collection of survivors, fragmented bands of horsemen and refugees emerging from the ravines and raid beds where they had hidden. Their world, the vast open plain that was their birthright and their temple, has been irrevocably poisoned. There is no thought of rebuilding, no hope of resistance. The Hunnic victory was not a defeat, it was an erasure. The choice is simple, stark, and absolute. Be absorbed into the Hunnic tide, becoming a slave warrior for the new masters, or run. For tens of thousands, the only answer is to run. The Alan diaspora begins not as a migration, but as a frantic, desperate, and chaotic exodus. This is not the slow, confident press of the Ayaziges, moving west in search of new pastures. This is a flight, a panicked stampede, with the full, terrifying weight of the Hunnic horde as the spur. They do not move in their old, ordered awls. They move in ragged, desperate streams, a human river of terrified survivors. The remaining cataphracts, their iron scale armor perhaps dented and scorched, their Kanto's lances now the tools of a rearguard, form a protective screen around the wagons that could be saved. Inside these, the women and children huddle, their eyes wide with the trauma of what they have seen, their world of felt, leather, and grass gone forever. Their horses are thin, ridden hard. Their remaining herds are a fraction of their former wealth. They are a nation on the foot, on the hoof, their faces turned west, to the only direction that does not hold the Huns. They are fleeing the steppe itself, a profound spiritual uprooting. They are leaving the endless grass sea, the only home their people have ever known, and they will never return. The wind at their backs, the wind that had always been their god, now carries the sound of their pursuers. But the lands to their west are not empty. The Huns, in their terrifying advance, had struck the Goths first. The Alans, in their flight, now crash into the very people who had been their neighbors and rivals, the Greuthungi Goths, the kingdom of Ermanaric, who are also in a state of total, terrified collapse. The two great refugee streams, one Sarmatian, one Germanic, collide and merge on the banks of the Dniester. It is a moment of profound, chaotic, and historic realignment. There are no kings here, no ancient treaties. There are only two defeated peoples, bound by a common terror, their wagons and herds and warriors mixing in a vast, desperate column of displacement. A new hybrid entity is born from this terror. The Alans, or at least this major branch of them, join their fate to these fleeing Goths. The Sarmatian Lancers, the masters of the horse, become the new vanguard of this moving nation. Their heavy cavalry, the last remnant of their broken kingdom, provides the military spine, the armored protective edge for the vast, slow-moving mass of Gothic infantry, their families, and their high wooden wagons. They are the scouts who ride ahead, their eyes searching not for pasture, but for a path, for an undefended river crossing, for a way out. They are the fierce rearguard that turns to face the first probes of the Hunnic advance. Their cantos lances a desperate dying echo of the old steppe warfare. The Alans, led by their own surviving nobles, men like Alathius and Saphrax, have become a people in service to another, their fate now tied to the Goths. This vast, blended, and terrified horde, Alans and Goths together, rolls west, a human avalanche pushed by the Hunnic storm. Their eyes are fixed on the last great barrier, the final line of the old world, the Danube. The river that had once been the Roman limes, the impenetrable guarded frontier, now looks like the only thing that can save them. It is no longer an obstacle to be raided. It is a shield, a moat, and perhaps a sanctuary. The Alan diaspora has begun their long, winding, and violent journey across the face of a dying empire, a journey that will take their dragon standards to the Pillars of Hercules and beyond, has now taken its first desperate steps. Not all Alans, not all the shattered remnants of the steppe, fled south to the Danube with the Gothic multitude. Another great stream of survivors, a separate, terrified artery of horsemen, women, and children, was pushed in a different direction by the Hunnic cataclysm. Their flight was not south, toward the familiar Roman limes of the Danube, but due west, a desperate, scrambling exodus that took them north of the Carpathian Mountains into the vast, dark, and unfamiliar wilderness of Germania Libera, free Germania. This was not their worlds. The endless sky, the open grass sea, the firm, dry earth, all of it was gone, replaced by a landscape of profound, vertical gloom. This was a land of ancient primeval forests, the great Hercynian wood, a place of colossal oaks, beeches, and pines so dense that the sun for miles could not find the forest floor. The air was cold, perpetually damp, and smelled of moss, decaying leaves, and the dark, peaty water of the bogs that lay hidden like traps in the clearings. The Alans, a people of the infinite horizontal, were now claustrophobic, hemmed in, their wagon homes struggling on the muddy, root-choked tracks, their horses chargers of the open plain, ill at ease in the suffocating, shadowy aisles between the trees. The sounds were all wrong, not the whisper of grass, but the drip of water, the snap of a twig, the distant howl of a wolf, and the constant, unnerving rustle of a world hidden in the undergrowth. In this cold, northern European darkness, they were not alone. The shockwave of the Hunnic arrival had not just broken the Alans, it had set all the peoples of the East into motion, a domino effect of terror and migration. As the Alans pushed west, a hunted, desperate band, they collided with other nations, also fleeing, also terrified. They met the Vandals, a great confederation of Germanic peoples, the Asding and the Siling, and they met the Suebi, a complex mix of tribes, remnants of the Marcomanni and Quadi, whom Marcus Aurelius had fought. These were not allies forged in council. They were a new, monstrous, and desperate super-horde, a rolling confederation of panic, forged in the crucible of a common fear. Once again, As they had with the Goths in the south, the Alans, with their unique military prowess, became the elite. They were the masters of the horse, the armored lancers, the cataphracts. Though their numbers were diminished, their Draco standards and their reputation for a terrifying mounted charge made them the natural vanguard, the military spine of this vast, moving nation of Germanic infantry. Under their own kings, like Respendiel, they became the armored fist of this new, hybrid people, a Sarmatian cavalry screen for a Vandal Swabian body. This entire shuddering mass of humanity, hundreds of thousands of people, with their high, solid-wheeled wagons, their vast, lowing herds, and their Elonic vanguard, now had only one direction, west. They rolled through the forests of Germania, a human avalanche, until they were stopped, not by an army, but by a river. This was the Rhenus, the Rhine. It was the other great Roman limes, the frontier of Gaul, the boundary that had held for 400 years, a line defended by a chain of legionary fortresses, watchtowers, and river patrols. But though empire in its dying convulsions had stripped the Rhine frontier of its legions, recalling them to Italy to fight other usurpers, other fires, the border was a hollow shell. The great horde arrived on the eastern bank in the depths of a winter of unusual supernatural cold. It was the end of the year, the last days of 406 CE. The river, a broad, powerful, and swift-moving barrier, was frozen solid. The air was still, brittle with cold, the breath of 100,000 people, and their animals a vast, low-lying cloud of fog. The crossing began on the night of the 31st of December. It was not an invasion. It was a desperate, frantic, and total act of transgression. There was no battle, only the sound, the terrible groaning and cracking sound of a great river's ice yielding under an impossible weight. The Alan Lancers went first, their Draco standards held high in the freezing, moonless dark. Their horses, nervous and slipping, tested the ice, their riders' armored weight a terrible burden. But the ice held. Behind them, the flood was unleashed. The Vandals, the Suebi, their entire nations, poured onto the frozen highway. The sound was a deafening, chaotic roar, the shouting of men, the wailing of children, the desperate lowing of cattle, and the constant grinding, screeching complaint of thousands of heavy, wooden wagons being dragged across the scarred surface of the ice. This was the sound of the end of a world. The Roman border, a concept that had defined Europe, had been breached not by an army, but by a stampede of refugees. The ice held long enough. As the first gray, watery light of the new year, 407 CE, broke, the western bank was a churned, muddy chaos of wagons, people, and herds. The limes was broken. The Alans, Vandals, and Suebi were inside. They were in Gaul, the rich, undefended, and terrified heart of the Roman West. The long, desperate journey of this Alanic branch, which had begun in the ashes of their steppe kingdom, had just crossed its final barrier, and their violent, winding path to the south, to Spain, and to the sea was now open before them. Not all Alans, not all the shattered remnants of the steppe, fled south to the Danube with the Gothic multitude. Another great stream of survivors, a separate, terrified artery of horsemen, women, and children, was pushed in a different direction by the Hunnic cataclysm. Their flight was not south, toward the familiar Roman limes of the Danube, but due west, a desperate, scrambling exodus that took them north of the Carpathian Mountains into the vast, dark, and unfamiliar wilderness of Germania Libera, free Germania. This was not their world. The endless sky, the open grass sea, the firm, dry earth, all of it was gone, replaced by a landscape of profound, vertical gloom. This was a land of ancient, primeval forests, the great Hercynian wood, a place of colossal oaks, beeches, and pines so dense that the sun for miles could not find the forest floor. The air was cold, perpetually damp, and smelled of moss, decaying leaves, and the dark, peaty water of the bogs that lay hidden like traps in the clearings. The Alans, a people of the infinite horizontal, were now claustrophobic and hemmed in, their wagon homes struggling on the muddy, root-choked tracks, their horses, chargers of the open plain, ill at ease in the suffocating, shadowy aisles between the trees. The sounds were all wrong, not the whisper of grass, but the drip of water, the snap of a twig, the distant howl of a wolf, and the constant unnerving rustle of a world hidden in the undergrowth. In this cold, northern European darkness, they were not alone. The shockwave of the Hunnic arrival had not just broken the Alans, it had set all the peoples of the East into motion, a domino effect of terror and migration. As the Alans pushed west, a hunted, desperate band, they collided with other nations, also fleeing, also terrified. They met the Vandals, a great confederation of Germanic peoples, the Asding and the Siling, and they met the Suebi, a complex mix of tribes, remnants of the Marcomanni and Quadi, whom Marcus Aurelius had fought. These were not allies forged in council. They were a new, monstrous, and desperate super-horde, a rolling confederation of panic, forged in the crucible of a common fear. Once again, as they had with the Goths in the south, the Alans, with their unique military prowess, became the elite. They were the masters of the horse, the armored lancers, the cataphracts. Though their numbers were diminished, their Draco standards and their reputation for a terrifying mounted charge made them the natural vanguard, the military spine of this vast, moving nation of Germanic infantry. Under their own kings, like Respendiel, they became the armored fist of this new, hybrid people, a Sarmatian cavalry screen for a Vandal Swabian body. This entire shuddering mass of humanity, hundreds of thousands of people with their high, solid-wheeled wagons, their vast, lowing herds, and their Alanic vanguard, now had only one direction, west. They rolled through the forests of Germania, a human avalanche, until they were stopped, not by an army, but by a river. This was the Rhenus, the Rhine. It was the other great Roman limes, the frontier of Gaul, the boundary that had held for 400 years, a line defended by a chain of legionary fortresses, watchtowers, and river patrols. But the empire, in its dying convulsions, had stripped the Rhine frontier of its legions, recalling them to Italy to fight other usurpers, other fires. The border was a hollow shell. The great horde arrived on the eastern bank in the depths of a winter of unusual, supernatural cold. It was the end of the year, the last days of 406 CE. The river, a broad, powerful, and swift-moving barrier, was frozen solid. The air was still, brittle with cold, the breath of 100,000 people, and their animals a vast, low-lying cloud of fog. The crossing began on the night of the 31st of December. It was not an invasion. It was a desperate, frantic, and total act of transgression. There was no battle, only the sound, the terrible groaning and cracking sound of a great river's ice yielding under an impossible weight. The Allen Lancers went first, their Draco standards held high in the freezing, moonless dark. Their horses, nervous and slipping, tested the ice, their riders' armored weight a terrible burden. But the ice held. Behind them, the flood was unleashed. The Vandals, the Suebi, their entire nations poured onto the frozen highway. The sound was a deafening, chaotic roar, the shouting of men, the wailing of children, the desperate lowing of cattle, and the constant grinding, screeching complaint of thousands of heavy wooden wagons being dragged across the scarred surface of the ice. This was the sound of the end of a world. The Roman border, a concept that had defined Europe, had been breached not by an army, but by a stampede of refugees. The ice held long enough. As the first gray, watery light of the new year, 407 CE, broke, the western bank was a churned, muddy chaos of wagons, people, and herds. The limes was broken. The Alans, Vandals, and Suebi were inside. They were in Gaul, the rich, undefended, and terrified heart of the Roman West. The long, desperate journey of this Alanic branch, which had begun in the ashes of their steppe kingdom, had just crossed its final barrier, and their violent, winding path to the south, to Spain, and to the sea was now open before them. While the great western diaspora of the Alans was writing its final, violent chapters in the dust of Spain and the sunlight of Africa, a different story, one not of flight but of fortitude, was unfolding in the homeland. The camera must rewind, must pull back from the Pillars of Hercules, all the way across the shattered map of Europe, back to the moment of the Hunnic cataclysm, back to the scoured, smoking plains of the Don and the Volga. When the Hunnic storm broke, it shattered the Hellenic nation into many fragments. We have followed the fragments that blew west, but there were others, those who, staring at the chaos, chose not to run across the world, but to retreat from it. These Alans, a great and substantial portion of the nation, turned their horses not toward the setting sun, but south. They fled toward the one landscape in their world that was the absolute antithesis of the steppe, the one place where the Hunnic pony archer held no advantage. They fled to the mountains. This was the Kavkaz, the Caucasus, a colossal saw-toothed wall of rock and ice that had always formed the southern boundary of their kingdom. It was a landscape of gods and eagles, a vertical world of impossible scale, its highest peaks, Elbrus and Kazbek, capped in eternal snows that gleamed like beacons against the high blue sky. This was not a land of grass. It was a land of stone. The retreat was a slow, arduous, and vertical migration. The remnants of the Hellenic owls, the surviving families and their herds, the last of the cataphracts, left the flat, poisoned plains behind. They moved into the foothills, a world of green, alpine meadows and deep, forested valleys. They pushed higher, their wagons struggling on the steep, rocky inclines until the wagons had to be abandoned, their possessions transferred to the backs of horses and oxen. They funneled into the great river-carved gorges, canyons of sheer gray rock where the sun reached the floor for only an hour a day. The sound of their movement was no longer the rumble of wheels on dry earth, but the clatter of hooves on stone and the constant roaring echo of fast-moving glacial water, a sound of cold, pure, and relentless power. They had entered their fortress. Here, in these high, defensible valleys, the Hunnic tide could not follow. A cataphract charge was useless here, but so was a Hunnic swirl. The war was now one of the narrow pass, the ambush from the high ledge, the defense of a single critical bridge. The Allans, the masters of the open space, now became the masters of the choke point. They settled in the high valleys of the central Caucasus, their new homeland a network of mountain strongholds. They had become the gatekeepers. The most famous of these passes, the Darial Gorge, a terrifying 12-kilometer cleft in the mountains, so narrow in places that the sky is just a ribbon of blue, became known to the chroniclers of the south, the Georgians, the Persians, the Romans, as the Porta Alani, the Alans' Gate. Here a new life was forged. The pure nomadism of the steppe was impossible. They became a transhuman people, a culture of the vertical pasture. In the summer, they drove their herds of sheep and cattle high up the mountainsides to the alpages, the alpine meadows above the tree line, a world of intense green, wildflowers, and thin, clean air. In the winter, they descended back to their fortified settlements in the protected valleys, their stone houses clustered together for warmth and defense. They built towers, tall, square, and tapering structures of dry stone masonry, which stood like sentinels in the valleys, watchtowers from which they could survey their new, constricted world. In this high, mountain-locked isolation, this Caucasian fortress, a profound transformation, or rather, a preservation occurred. The Alans of the West were a diaspora, their blood and language dissolving into the Vandal, Gothic, and Roman populations. They were a stream that had dissipated into a delta. But these Alans of the Caucasus were a stream that had been caught in a deep, high mountain lake. The mountains were a vessel that held their identity intact. Here, insulated from the great, chaotic storms that were leveling the Roman Empire, they endured. They kept their language, the Eastern Iranian dialect of the Sarmatian Hellenic people. They kept their culture, their deep warrior ethos, their profound connection to the horse, and they kept their stories, their Nart sagas, an epic cycle of myths populated by giant iron-bodied heroes, wise women, and magical horses, a body of legend that carried the clear, unmistakable DNA of their Scythian and Sarmatian ancestors. They were a fragment of the ancient steppe world, frozen, or rather preserved, in the high, cold air of the mountains. They would endure here for 1,000 years, a small, tough, and independent kingdom known to their neighbors as Alania. They would see the fall of Rome, the rise of the Caliphate, the coming of the Mongols, and the expansion of the Russian Empire. They are the Alans who never left, the ones who weathered the storm by climbing above it. And their direct descendants, the people who still live in those valleys, who still speak that Iranian-rooted language, who still tell the tales of the Nart heroes, are the Ossetians of today, a living, breathing echo of the lost Sarmatian Sea. The high, thin mountain air of the Caucasus dissolves. The sharp gray peaks of the fortress of Alania, the stone towers, the deep, roaring gorges, all fade, softening into mist. The camera drifts, unmoored from time, carried on a high continental wind, back to the source, back to the great flat heartland. It descends slowly, spiraling down from the cold, high altitudes, until it is once more just above the ground, gliding low over the endless, waving surface of the grass sea. The light is different now. It is the end of the day. The sun, a low, molten disk, bleeds a deep, coppery gold across the western horizon, and the sky above is a darkening, bruised velvet. The long, lingering shadows of the unseen world stretch for miles, the smallest blade of grass casting a long, dark line. Here, in the vast, unbroken emptiness of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the story begins its return to silence. The only sound is the wind, a constant, sibilant hush, the breath of the continent, unchanged, eternal. It moves through the tall, feathery grass, bowing it in long, slow, oceanic waves, a rhythmic, hypnotic motion that has no beginning and no end. The air is cool, carrying the scent of dry earth, of dust, and the faint, sweet perfume of the artemisia, the wormwood that grows wild. The earth is a deep, rich, and darkening color, the black soil that once fed the grain ships of the Greeks, that once sustained the vast herds of the Scythians, that once felt the thunder of the cataphract. The camera, moving with the wind, drifts over a low, soft, man-made hill. It is a kurgan. Its precise geometric shape, the sharp circle of its base, has been softened by 25 centuries of rain and melting snow, its contours blurred, its slopes gently surrendering back to the plain. It is a sleeping earthen heart, covered in the same rippling grass as the land around it, its presence a quiet, unassuming question in the landscape. It is one of thousands, a silent constellation of tombs, the only monuments this world of motion ever built. The golden stags of Filipovka are far to the east, buried in their frost. The warrior women are here, and in the next mound, and in the one after that, their iron arrowheads and daggers, long since fused by rust into the dark, silent soil. What is left? What remains of the thunder, the gold, and the long migration? The wind, as it passes over the mound, seems to carry a sound, a fractional acoustic memory, a whisper so faint it is almost a feeling. It is the high, reedy hiss of a Draco standard, a sound that terrified the legions on the Danube, a sound that echoed for a moment in the damp, misty F-Aushules of Britannia, planting a dragon seed that would sleep for centuries, to be woven into the dreams of a different nation. The wind carries, perhaps, the thinnest metallic ring of a smith's hammer, the ghost of the sound that forged the iron scales, a sound that gave birth to the armored knight, a sound whose echo would define a different age, a different kind of war, long after the Kontos itself had turned to dust. The wind carries the memory of the names: Alan, Ayaziches, Roxolani. They are sounds that have lost their people. They are labels in the histories of others, footnotes to the fall of Rome, chapters in the annals of the Goths. The Alans who crossed the frozen Rhine, their diaspora is a cascade of echoes. Their bloodline is a thread of DNA woven into the fabric of modern Europe. Their name, Alan, a common given name, its owners unaware of the steppe lancers and the polychrome griffins from which it came. The ghost of their African kingdom, the Vandal Alan dream, is just a layer of dust in the ruins of Carthage, a story of a brief, violent flare under a hot southern sun. But the wind, as it blows south, remembers the mountains. It brushes the high, cold peaks of the Caucasus, the fortress that held the stream, the deep mountain lake that did not dissipate. There, the echo is not a ghost. It is a living voice. It is the Ossetian tongue, the last surviving whisper of the Scythian Sarmatian language, still spoken, still sung. It is the Nart saga, the ancient epic, still told by the fire, a story of iron heroes and of the steppe, a dream of the open grass sea, kept alive in the heart of the stone. The camera pulls back, Rising higher from the lonely kurgan, the mound shrinks, becoming just a soft, dark circle on the plain. The wind's imagined sounds, the hiss and the hammer, fade, dissolving into the one true constant sound of the grass itself. We rise higher, and the steppe opens, its true, impossible scale revealed. The rivers, the Don and the Volga, are now just ribbons of mercury, reflecting the last, fading purple light of the sky. More kurgans are visible, dozens, then hundreds, scattered like soft shadows, the quiet, final punctuation of a story that is now complete. The land has endured. The land has absorbed the wagons, the horses, the herds, the iron, and the gold. It has absorbed the people. We are very high now at the edge of the darkness. The first, cold stars begin to pierce the velvet. They are the same stars that watched the Auls form their defensive circles, the same stars that guided the migration west, the same stars that shone on the frozen Danube. They look down on a world that is now, once again, quiet. The great convulsive movement of the Sarmatian people is over. The long, slow breath of the steppe continues. The grass waves, the night deepens. The silence is total, a vast, calm, and healing presence. The story has returned to the earth, and the earth is at peace, turning slowly under the stars toward the quiet, oncoming dark.